Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. There are moments in life that feel so ordinary they barely register. A Tuesday morning, a drive home from work, a text message saying you'll be there soon. These are the moments we forget almost as soon as they happen because nothing about them suggests they matter. Nothing about them whispers danger. And yet, for 5 people living separate lives in different parts of the country, these unremarkable moments became the last ones anyone would remember them having. Not because something violent happened in plain sight, but because normalcy itself became the disguise. Lena Whitmore was 23 years old and living in a river town where everyone knew everyone. Or at least thought they did. She had a daughter, barely 2 years old, with eyes that looked just like hers. Lena worked part-time at a local diner, the kind of place where the coffee was always hot and the regulars had their own booths. She wasn't trying to change the world. She was trying to get through each day with enough left over to smile at her little girl before bed. Her life was small, but it was hers, and she liked it that way. She had friends who checked in on her. She had a mother who watched her daughter when she worked late. She had routines that felt safe because they'd been the same for months. On the night she disappeared, Lena had finished her shift just after 9. She'd wiped down tables, counted her tips, and texted her mother to say she'd be home soon. She didn't own a car, so rides were part of her routine. Sometimes a coworker gave her a lift. Sometimes she walked. That night, someone offered, and she accepted. It wasn't a stranger. It was someone she knew. Someone who'd been kind before. Someone whose face didn't set off any alarms. She climbed into the passenger seat, buckled her seatbelt, and probably talked about nothing important. Maybe the weather. Maybe her daughter. Maybe she was already thinking about what she'd do when she got home. She never made it. Rhea Calder lived 3 states away, in a suburb that looked like every other suburb. Neat lawns. Quiet streets. The kind of place where people jogged in the mornings and waved at their neighbors. Rhea was trying to rebuild. She'd recently ended a relationship that had left her shaken, though she didn't talk about it much. She was the type to handle things privately, to put on a calm face even when she felt anything but calm inside. Her friends noticed she seemed lighter lately, like she was finally breathing again. She'd started going out more. She'd picked up a hobby. She was texting people back. She was, by all appearances, moving forward. But moving forward doesn't erase the past. And the past, for Rhea, included someone who didn't want to let go. Someone who knew her routines. Someone who knew which coffee shop she went to on Sunday mornings and what time she usually got home from work. Rhea thought she'd been careful. She'd blocked the number. She'd told her friends. She'd changed a few small things about her day to create distance. But careful doesn't always mean safe. The night Rhea vanished, her phone continued to send messages. Her social media stayed active. To anyone watching from the outside, she seemed fine. But Rhea wasn't the one holding the phone. Noelle Park was a university student living in a city that buzzed with energy. She loved it there. Loved the anonymity of being one face among thousands. Loved the coffee shops that stayed open late and the bookstores that smelled like old paper. She was studying psychology, fascinated by why people did the things they did, how trauma shaped them, how trust could be built and broken. She was smart, cautious in some ways and fearless in others. She met people easily. She used dating apps the way everyone her age did, swiping through faces and hoping to find something real among the noise. She met someone online who seemed different, thoughtful, articulate, someone who asked questions and actually listened to the answers. They talked for weeks before meeting in person. Noelle told her roommate where she was going. She shared her location. She did the things young women are told to do to stay safe. And maybe that's why what happened next felt so impossible. Because she'd done everything right. She'd been smart. She'd been careful. And yet, when she didn't come home that night, her roommate found her phone still pinging at a location Noelle had never mentioned. The messages kept coming, casual and unconcerned, as if Noelle were simply busy and would explain later. Miles Harrow was a musician, the kind who played in bars where the lights were dim and the crowds were small but loyal. He didn't make much money, but he didn't need much. He lived simply, moved between gigs, crashed on friends' couches when he needed to. He wasn't trying to be famous. He just wanted to play. Music was the only thing that made sense to him. The only language he trusted completely. People like Miles. He was easygoing, quick to laugh, slow to anger. He didn't have enemies. He didn't owe anyone money. He didn't live the kind of life that invited danger. But danger doesn't always need an invitation. Miles disappeared on a night when he was supposed to play a show. He never made it to the venue. His guitar was found in his car, which was parked in a lot he had no reason to be in. There were no signs of struggle, no witnesses, no clear explanation. His friends called hospitals. They called the police. They posted on social media. For a while, people paid attention. But as days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months, Miles's disappearance became one of those stories that people remembered vaguely but couldn't quite place. The musician who vanished. The case that went cold almost immediately. Elise Monroe was 31 and had just found out she was pregnant. She hadn't told many people yet. She was still processing it herself, still deciding how she felt, still imagining what her life might look like in a year. She was a professional, the type who kept her personal life separate from her work life, who showed up on time and stayed late when needed. She was organized. She was competent. She was someone people relied on. At home, she was quieter, more uncertain. She'd been in a relationship for years, one that looked stable from the outside, but felt complicated when the door closed, and it was just the two of them. Elise had started searching for things online late at night. Questions she didn't ask out loud. Concerns she didn't voice to friends. Her search history, later uncovered by investigators, painted a picture of someone who was afraid but didn't know how to name the fear. She looked up how to leave safely. She researched shelters. She read articles about coercive control. And then, one night, she stopped searching. Her phone went silent. Her social media froze. Her coworkers noticed she didn't show up for an important meeting, which was unlike her. Her friends texted and got no response. Her family called and reached voicemail. Elise, who had been methodical and careful her entire life, seemed to have simply stopped existing. 5 people, 5 separate lives, 5 different circumstances. And yet, when you looked closely, when you peeled back the surface and examined what lay underneath, patterns began to emerge. Not patterns of violence in the traditional sense. Not strangers lurking in alleyways or predators hiding in shadows. These were patterns of trust being exploited, of normalcy being weaponized, of the very things that made people feel safe, routines and relationships and familiar faces, becoming the tools of their undoing. None of them suspected. That's the part that stays with you. None of them woke up that morning and thought, this is the day. None of them felt the shift. Because Miles's bandmates showed up at the venue and waited. They texted him. They called him. They checked the parking lot, thinking maybe he'd arrived early and was sitting in his car, running through the set list in his head like he sometimes did. But his car wasn't there. An hour passed. Then 2. The show had to start without him, and the whole night felt wrong. After the gig, they drove to his apartment. No answer. They called hospitals. They called mutual friends. No one had seen him. No one had heard from him. His phone went straight to voicemail, and when they tried to ping his location, there was nothing. It was like he'd been erased. Elise's absence was noticed at work first. She had a meeting scheduled for 9 in the morning, an important one, the kind she would never miss without notice. When she didn't show, her boss called her cell. No answer. He sent an email. No response. He called the front desk to see if she'd signed in earlier. She hadn't. By noon, concern was spreading through the office. Elise was reliable. She didn't do this. A coworker volunteered to drive by her apartment, just to check. When they arrived, Elise's car was in the parking lot. Her lights were off. No one answered the door. They called the police, not because they thought something terrible had happened, but because they couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. Law enforcement responded the way they always do in the beginning. With questions. With hesitation. With a checklist of possibilities that almost always ruled out foul play. Adults go missing all the time, they said. Most of them come back. Most of them left on purpose. Was there a fight? A breakup? A financial problem? Was there any history of mental health struggles? Any reason to believe the person might want to disappear? These questions, meant to be practical, felt like accusations to the families. They felt like dismissals, because the implication underneath every question was the same. Your loved one chose this. Your loved one wanted to leave. Your loved one is fine, just somewhere else, living a life they didn't tell you about. But the families knew better. They knew their daughters, their friends, their loved ones. They knew the difference between choosing to leave and being taken. And they knew, in the deepest part of themselves, that something had gone terribly wrong. Lena's mother filed a missing person report within hours. The officer who took it was kind but cautious. He asked about Lena's relationships. Had she been seeing anyone? Was there a custody dispute over her daughter? Was there any chance she'd gone somewhere to clear her head? Lena's mother answered every question, her voice getting tighter with each one. No, she said. No. Lena wouldn't do this. Lena wouldn't leave her daughter. Not without a word. Not without a call. The officer nodded, took notes, and said they'd look into it. But his tone suggested he'd heard this before. Worried mothers. Daughters who turned up a few days later, embarrassed but safe. Ria's friends went to the police the next day. They brought screenshots of the messages, pointed out the inconsistencies, explained why the tone felt wrong. The officer listened, but his expression didn't change. People text differently when they're stressed, he said. People say things out of character when they're going through something. Had Ria been struggling lately? Had she mentioned feeling overwhelmed? The friends looked at each other. Yes, they said. She'd been through a hard breakup, but she was doing better. She was moving on. The officer wrote something down. He said he'd make a note of it. He said to call back if she didn't turn up in a couple of days. The friends left feeling unheard, like they'd failed some invisible test of credibility. Noelle's roommate filed a report the next morning. She brought her phone, showed the officer the location history, explained that Noelle had never mentioned this address. The officer asked if Noelle had been meeting someone from a dating app. The roommate said yes. The officer nodded slowly. These things happen, he said. Sometimes people meet someone and decide to stay the night. Sometimes they don't want to check in with their roommate. Sometimes they just want privacy. The roommate's frustration boiled over. This isn't like her, she said. Noelle always texts. Always. The officer said he understood, but there wasn't much they could do yet. Not until more time had passed. Not until there was evidence of something criminal. Miles's friends were told the same thing. Adults have the right to disappear. Unless there was evidence of foul play, unless there was a sign of struggle or a credible threat, the police couldn't launch a full investigation. They could file a report. They could keep his information on record. But they couldn't force someone to come home. Miles's friends left the station feeling helpless. They created a Facebook group. They posted his photo everywhere. They organized search parties, combing through parks and trails and empty lots, hoping to find something the police had missed. Elisa's co-workers called the police, and because her car was there and her apartment was locked and there was no sign of her, the response was slightly different. Officers came to her building. They knocked on her door. When no one answered, they contacted the landlord. They entered the apartment carefully, looking for signs of struggle, signs of violence, signs of anything that might explain why a woman who'd been living a normal life had suddenly stopped. But the apartment looked normal. Dishes in the sink, bed made, laundry folded. Nothing appeared disturbed. Her phone wasn't there. Her purse wasn't there. It looked like she'd left, voluntarily, for some unknown reason. The gap between disappearance and action is where hope starts to fray. Hours become days. Days become a week. And in that time, families oscillate between belief and despair. They tell themselves their loved one is okay, just out of touch, just dealing with something privately. And then they remember the last conversation, the last text, the last normal moment, and they realize how wrong it feels. How impossible it is that someone they know so well could simply choose silence. Lena's mother stopped sleeping. She kept her phone on the loudest setting, convinced that any second, it would ring and Lena's voice would be on the other end, apologizing for worrying her, explaining that there'd been a misunderstanding, that she'd lost track of time, that she was fine. But the phone didn't ring. Days passed. The diner manager called to ask if Lena was coming back to work. Lena's mother broke down on the phone. She doesn't just not show up, she said. You know her. You know she wouldn't do this. The manager agreed. It wasn't like Lena. None of it was. Ria's friends kept monitoring her social media. The posts continued. Pictures of coffee, a sunset, a quote about moving forward. But Ria hadn't taken those photos. They were old, pulled from her camera roll, posted as if she were still living her normal life. The friends tried messaging her again, asking pointed questions only the real Ria would know how to answer. The responses were vague, deflective, wrong. They went back to the police with this new information, and this time, the officer took it more seriously. He asked for access to her accounts. He asked about her ex. He asked if there'd been any threats. The friends didn't know. Ria hadn't said. But now they were replaying every conversation, looking for clues they'd missed. Noelle's roommate couldn't let it go. She drove to the address where Noelle's phone had last pinged. It was a residential street, ordinary and quiet. She knocked on doors. Most people didn't answer. The ones who did said they didn't know anyone named Noelle. One person said they'd seen a car parked outside a few nights ago, but they hadn't paid much attention. The roommate took photos of the street, of the houses, of anything that might help later. She called the police again, demanding they do something. They said they were looking into it. They said these things took time. She wanted to scream. Time was the one thing Noelle didn't have. Miles's case went cold faster than the others. There were no social media updates, no phone activity, no sightings, just a car in a parking lot and a man who'd vanished. His friends refused to give up. They printed flyers. They contacted local news stations. A few picked up the story. Missing musician. Last seen here. If you know anything, please call. Tips came in, but none of them led anywhere. Someone thought they'd seen him at a gas station 2 towns over. Someone else said he'd talked about leaving, starting fresh somewhere new. But his friends knew better. Miles loved his life. He wouldn't have left his guitar. He wouldn't have walked away from the people who mattered to him. Elise's family hired a private investigator. The police were moving slowly, treating her disappearance as low priority because there was no evidence of a crime. But her family knew Elise. They knew she was pregnant. They knew she'd been scared, even if she hadn't said it out loud. The investigators started digging into her relationship, into her partner's background, into the dynamics that existed behind closed doors. What he found wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. Small controlling behaviors. Financial oversight. Isolation disguised as intimacy. The kind of thing that didn't look dangerous until you saw the whole pattern. And patterns were beginning to emerge. Not just within each case, but across them. Trust had been weaponized. That's what investigators would later say when they looked back at these cases with the clarity that only hindsight provides. But in the moment, when families were frantic and police were cautious and days were bleeding into weeks, no one could see the pattern yet. They saw 5 separate disappearances. 5 unrelated people. 5 different circumstances. What they didn't see was the common thread that connected them all. The thread wasn't a person. It wasn't a location. It was a method. A way of making someone vanish that didn't look like violence because it was wrapped in familiarity. Lena had trusted the person who offered her a ride. Why wouldn't she? This wasn't a stranger. This was someone who'd been kind before, someone who'd helped her out, someone whose face had become part of the landscape of her daily life. In a small town, trust operates differently than it does in a city. People know each other. They rely on each other. The idea that someone familiar could be dangerous feels like a betrayal of the entire social fabric. So when Lena climbed into that car, she wasn't being reckless. She was being normal. She was accepting help the way people in her town always did. And that normalcy, that trust, became the thing that erased her. Her phone was found 3 days later in a ditch off a rural highway, 20 miles from where she'd last been seen. The screen was cracked. The battery was dead. When police charged it and examined it, they found her last text to her mother, sent at 9:14 in the evening. The message after that hadn't been sent by Lena. It had been sent at 9:42, a full half hour later, and it said she was staying at a friend's house and would be home in the morning. The wording was wrong. Lena didn't write like that. She used abbreviations. She used emojis. This message was formal, stilted, like someone trying to sound like her, but not quite getting it right. Her mother had received that message and felt a flicker of relief mixed with confusion. It didn't sound like Lena, but at least it was something. At least it meant she was alive, somewhere, with someone. But Lena hadn't written it. And by the time her mother realized that, Lena had already been gone for hours. Ria's phone told a similar story. Messages continued for days after she disappeared. They responded to friends. They posted on social media. They maintained the illusion of a life continuing as normal. But the language was off. Ria had a specific way of communicating, a rhythm to her words, a particular sense of humor that didn't translate into the messages now appearing under her name. Her best friend noticed it first. Ria always signed off with a specific phrase when they were making plans. She'd done it for years. It was a small thing, almost a joke, but it was consistent. The messages coming through now didn't include it. And when her friend pointed this out to others, they started noticing more discrepancies. Rhea never used that emoji. Rhea would never phrase it that way. Rhea wouldn't cancel plans without a better explanation. They brought all of this to the police, laying it out like a puzzle. Look, they said, this isn't her. Someone else is using her phone. Someone else is pretending to be her. The detective assigned to the case started to see what they meant. He requested phone records, looked at location data, examined the metadata attached to each message. What he found was chilling. Rhea's phone had been moving in patterns that didn't match her normal routine. It had been in places she'd never been. And the messages, when analyzed for typing patterns and word choice, showed inconsistencies that suggested multiple authors or someone trying to imitate her style without fully understanding it. Rhea's ex-boyfriend was brought in for questioning. He claimed he hadn't seen her since the breakup. He said he'd moved on, that he respected her decision, that he had no reason to contact her. But his phone records told a different story. There were deleted messages. There were location pings that placed him near her apartment on the night she disappeared. There were searches on his computer, looked up days before she vanished, about how to access someone's social media accounts, how to clone a phone, how to make it look like someone was still active online when they weren't. He didn't confess. Not then. He maintained his innocence, his voice calm, his demeanor controlled. He had an explanation for everything. The deleted messages were spam. The location data was a glitch. The searches were for a project, something he'd been curious about, nothing sinister. And without Rhea, without a body, without concrete proof that she'd been harmed, the police couldn't arrest him. They could only watch, and wait, and hope he'd make a mistake. Noelle's case took a darker turn when investigators finally accessed her dating app history. The person she'd been talking to had created a profile using a real person's photos, but that person had never heard of the account. It was a fabrication, a carefully constructed identity designed to seem trustworthy, educated, normal. The messages Noelle had received were thoughtful and patient, building rapport over weeks. Whoever was behind the account knew how to make someone feel seen, how to create a sense of connection that felt genuine. Noelle had been careful, but careful doesn't protect you from someone who spent time studying how to bypass caution. The real person whose photos had been used was horrified. He'd had no idea his images were being stolen, used to lure women into conversations, into meetings, into danger. He cooperated fully with police, providing everything he could, but it didn't lead anywhere immediately useful. The account had been created using fake information. The email address was untraceable. The IP address bounced through multiple proxies. Whoever had done this knew how to hide. Noelle's roommate kept searching. She printed flyers and posted them around campus, around the neighborhood where Noelle's phone had last been. She talked to local businesses, asking if anyone had seen her friend. Most people shook their heads, offered sympathy, promised to keep an eye out. But one person remembered something. A man had come into a convenience store late that night, bought cigarettes and bottled water, seemed agitated. The clerk couldn't say for sure it was connected, but they remembered because the man had been fidgeting with a phone, 2 phones actually, like he was trying to manage both at once. The police followed up. They pulled security footage from the store. The image was grainy, low resolution, but it showed a figure matching the description. They couldn't make out a face. They couldn't see a license plate, but it was something. A thread to pull, a direction to move in. Miles's case remained the most opaque. There were no messages after he disappeared, no phone activity, no digital trail. His car had been found in a parking lot near a river, doors unlocked, keys on the driver's seat, guitar in the back. It looked staged, like someone wanted it to be found, but didn't care about making it look believable. His friends couldn't make sense of it. Miles was careful with his guitar. He'd never leave it in an unlocked car. He'd never leave his keys out in the open. None of it fit. Police searched the area around the parking lot. They brought in dogs. They walked the riverbank. They checked nearby buildings. Nothing. It was as if Miles had simply stepped out of his car and evaporated. Weeks passed, then months. The case grew cold, not because police stopped caring, but because there was nothing to follow. No evidence. No witnesses. No leads. Miles's face appeared on missing person posters that slowly faded in the sun. His name mentioned less and less as time moved forward and new cases demanded attention. But his friends didn't forget. They kept his Facebook group active. They kept posting updates, kept asking for tips, kept reminding people that Miles was still out there, somewhere, and someone had to know something. The not knowing was the worst part. The absence of answers. The way hope and despair took turns crushing them. Elise's story was unfolding differently because investigators had something the others didn't. They had a suspect. They had a person who'd been in Elise's life, who'd had access to her, who'd had motive and opportunity. Her partner. The man she'd been living with. The man she'd been planning a future with, or trying to, until she'd started searching for ways to leave. The private investigator had uncovered enough to convince police to take a harder look. They brought him in for questioning. He was calm, cooperative, confused, even. He said Elise had been stressed about work. He said she'd been worried about the pregnancy, unsure if she was ready. He said they'd talked about it, that she'd seemed conflicted, and one morning he'd woken up and she was gone. He assumed she'd needed space. He assumed she'd come back when she was ready. He hadn't reported her missing because he thought she'd left on purpose. The detective interviewing him didn't buy it. There was something too controlled about the man's responses, too rehearsed. He asked about Elise's phone. The man said she'd taken it with her. He asked about her car. The man said it was in the parking lot because she'd taken an Uber, or maybe a friend had picked her up. He wasn't sure. He asked about the pregnancy. The man's face flickered, just for a second, something passing through his expression that he couldn't quite hide. He said they'd been happy about it. He said they were going to work it out. But Elise's search history told a different story. She'd been looking up shelters. She'd been reading articles about leaving abusive relationships. She'd been researching her rights, her options, her safety. She'd been planning to go, and she'd been terrified of what might happen when she did. The detective laid this out, gently at first, then more firmly. What were you really arguing about? What was Elise really afraid of? What happened the night she disappeared? The man's lawyer stopped the interview before he could answer. Digital forensics became the key to unraveling what had happened in these cases. In an age where everyone carries a device that tracks their location, records their communications, and archives their thoughts, disappearing completely is almost impossible. But appearing to be alive when you're not, that's easier than most people realize. All it takes is access to a phone, knowledge of someone's passwords, and the willingness to maintain the illusion. Investigators began to see how it worked. A phone is taken. Messages are sent from it to create the appearance of normalcy, to buy time, to delay panic. Social media posts are scheduled or pulled from old photos. Friends and family receive reassurances that sound almost right, but not quite. And by the time anyone realizes something is wrong, hours or days have passed. The trail has gone cold. The window for finding someone alive has narrowed. Lena's phone had been used to send that single message to her mother. Then it had been discarded. Whoever took it didn't need it anymore. The message had done its job. It had created doubt, delayed the missing person report, given the perpetrator time to disappear. Ria's phone had been used more extensively. Messages had been sent for days, maintaining the fiction that she was fine, just busy, just needing space. Her ex-boyfriend, police suspected, had her phone. He'd studied her communication style. He'd tried to replicate it. He'd made mistakes, small ones, but enough that people who knew Ria well could tell something was wrong. The phone was still pinging, still active, but Ria wasn't the one using it. Noelle's phone had gone dark after a few hours. A handful of messages sent to her roommate, casual and unconcerned, then nothing. The phone was either destroyed or turned off, its last known location that residential street where no one admitted to seeing her. Miles's phone had never been recovered. It wasn't in his car. It wasn't in his apartment. Wherever Miles was, his phone had gone with him, or it had been destroyed so thoroughly that no trace remained. The silence was absolute, and that silence told its own story. Someone had wanted Miles to vanish without a trace, without a thread to follow. Elise's phone was the most damning piece of evidence in her case. It had been found, eventually, hidden in a storage unit that belonged to her partner. When forensics examined it, they found it had been factory reset, wiped clean of everything. But digital information is stubborn. Even when deleted, fragments remain. Technicians were able to recover some of her search history, some of her messages, enough to paint a picture of a woman who'd been afraid and planning to leave, and enough to suggest that someone had wanted to erase that picture entirely. The families were living in a state of suspended reality. They couldn't grieve because they didn't have confirmation. They couldn't move forward because there was nothing to move forward from. They existed in a liminal space between hope and despair, A space where every phone call might be the one that changes everything, and every day that passes without news feels like another small death. Lena's mother kept her daughter's room exactly as it had been. She washed the sheets. She dusted the shelves. She kept fresh flowers on the nightstand because Lena had always liked flowers. Her granddaughter asked when Mommy was coming home, and she didn't know how to answer. She said soon, sweetheart, soon, even though she didn't believe it. Even though every day that passed made soon feel more like never. Ria's friends organized vigils. They stood in parks holding candles, their faces drawn and tired. They spoke about Ria in the present tense because using the past tense felt like giving up. They talked about her laugh, her kindness, her strength. They urged anyone with information to come forward. They begged whoever had taken her to let her go. They didn't say what they were all thinking, that it might already be too late. Noelle's roommates stopped sleeping in their apartment. It felt wrong being there without her. Every time she walked past Noelle's empty room, she felt a physical ache. She stayed with friends. She threw herself into classes. She talked to reporters who wanted to cover the story, hoping that media attention might shake something loose, might make someone remember something they'd seen. Miles's bandmates played a tribute show. They dedicated it to him, played all his favorite songs, left his spot on stage empty. The audience knew why they were there. They held up lighters and phone screens, a sea of small lights in the darkness. Afterward, people came up to share memories of Miles, to say they were praying for him, to promise they hadn't forgotten. But memories and prayers don't bring someone home. Elise's family held a press conference. They stood in front of cameras and microphones and pleaded for information. Her mother's voice shook as she described her daughter. Beautiful, smart, kind, pregnant, afraid, missing. She looked directly into the camera and said, "If you know where Elise is, please tell us. If you know what happened to her, please come forward. We just want to bring her home." Elise's partner did not attend the press conference. Time is a strange thing when someone you love is missing. It moves too fast and too slow simultaneously. Days blur together, but individual moments stretch into eternities. You exist in a constant state of waiting. Waiting for the phone to ring. Waiting for a knock on the door. Waiting for news, good or bad. Anything that might resolve the unbearable uncertainty. And the waiting changes you. It hollows you out. It takes something essential and replaces it with a kind of vigilance that never rests. The search is continued. Volunteers organized into groups, mapping out areas, walking through woods and fields, checking abandoned buildings. They found things, lost items, pieces of trash, remnants of other people's lives, but they didn't find the missing. They didn't find the answers everyone desperately needed. In Lena's town, the river became a focal point. It was deep and old and had a reputation for keeping secrets. People whispered about it. Maybe she's in the water. Maybe that's where she ended up. But the river was vast, and searching it properly required resources the local police department didn't have. They did what they could with what they had, but it wasn't enough. In Ria's case, attention turned to her ex-boyfriend. People who knew him began coming forward with stories. He'd been possessive, they said. Controlling. Jealous. He hadn't taken the breakup well. He'd shown up at her work once, unannounced, and she'd looked uncomfortable. These details, small on their own, began to form a larger picture. Police executed a search warrant on his apartment. They found Ria's phone hidden in a drawer, turned off, wrapped in a plastic bag. They found her laptop. They found items that belonged to her, things she would never have left behind voluntarily. He was arrested, not for murder, because they didn't have a body, but for theft, for stalking, for violating a restraining order Ria had filed and never told her friends about because she'd been trying to handle it privately. He was held without bail, and investigators pressed him for answers. Where is she? What did you do? What happened that night? He refused to speak. He invoked his right to remain silent, and behind that silence, Ria remained missing. Noelle's case gained traction when a second woman came forward. She'd been contacted by the same fake dating profile months earlier. She'd agreed to meet the person, but at the last minute, something had fell off and she'd canceled. She'd felt paranoid at the time, silly for being so cautious. Now she felt lucky to be alive. She gave police everything she had, every message, every detail. They analyzed the communication patterns, the word choices, the manipulation techniques. They were dealing with someone who knew what they were doing, someone who'd done this before, someone who might do it again. A task force was formed. Detectives from multiple jurisdictions began comparing notes, looking for connections between Noelle's case and other missing persons reports. They found similarities. Women who'd vanished after meeting someone from a dating app. Women who'd been careful but not careful enough. Women whose phones had gone silent after sending a final message saying they were fine. The pattern was there, undeniable and horrifying. They were dealing with someone who hunted online, who used technology as a tool, who understood that the digital world offered both connection and anonymity. Miles's case remained isolated. There were no similar disappearances that matched his circumstances. No pattern to identify. No profile to build. He existed as an outlier, a single data point that didn't connect to anything else. And that made him easy to forget, at least for the system. But his friends refused to let that happen. They kept pushing, kept investigating on their own, kept following threads that police had dismissed as dead ends. One of them, a woman who'd known Miles since high school, started looking into the parking lot where his car had been found. She learned it was owned by a company that rented storage units. She learned that the company had security cameras, but police had checked the footage and found nothing useful. She went there herself, walked the lot, studied the angles. She realized there was a blind spot, a section of the lot that the cameras didn't cover. She asked to see the rental records. The company refused, citing privacy. She filed a formal request. It took weeks, but eventually she got access to a list of people who'd rented units around the time Miles disappeared. One name caught her attention. Someone who'd rented a unit for a single month, paid in cash, provided minimal information. She brought this to the police. They followed up, executed a search warrant. The unit was empty by then, cleaned out, but forensic teams found traces of blood. Not a lot, but enough. DNA testing would take time, but there was finally something concrete to work with. Elisa's partner was charged with her murder even though her body hadn't been found. The prosecutor believed they had enough evidence. The internet searches on his computer. Elisa's own searches showing her fear. The timeline of her disappearance. The factory reset phone hidden in his storage unit. Testimony from Elisa's friends about controlling behavior they'd witnessed. It was a circumstantial case, but the prosecutor argued it was a strong one. The defense countered that without a body, without proof of death, it was all speculation. Elise could have left. Elise could be alive somewhere, starting over, choosing not to come back. The jury would have to decide. The trial was months away, but the arrest brought a strange kind of relief to Elisa's family. Not closure, because there was still no body, no confirmation, no final goodbye. But at least something was happening. At least someone was being held accountable. At least the system was acknowledging that Elise hadn't just wandered off. That something had been done to her. That someone was responsible. Meanwhile, the waiting continued for the others. Lena's case had grown cold again after the initial burst of activity. Tips had come in, been investigated, led nowhere. Her mother called the detective assigned to the case every week, asking for updates. There were rarely any. The detective was sympathetic but honest. Without new evidence, without a witness, without something to point them in a new direction, there wasn't much they could do. The case was still open. They hadn't given up. But they also weren't actively working it every day. Ria's ex-boyfriend remained in jail, refusing to cooperate, refusing to tell anyone where she was. Prosecutors were building a case, but without a body, charging him with murder was complicated. They had enough to hold him on other charges, enough to keep him locked up while they continued investigating. But Ria's family wanted answers, not just incarceration. They wanted to know what happened. They wanted to bring their daughter home. Noelle's task force made an arrest. A man in another state, someone with a history of online predation, someone whose patterns matched the profile they'd built. He denied everything. His lawyer said the evidence was circumstantial, that being a bad person didn't make you a murderer. But investigators found deleted messages on his computer, fragments of conversations with women who'd later vanished. They found photos that didn't belong to him. They found a hard drive with searches that painted a disturbing picture of his interests and intentions. He was charged with multiple counts. The trial would be lengthy, complicated, involving victims from different states and years. But at least there was progress. At least there was movement. Noelle's roommate attended every hearing, sat in the gallery, stared at the man who might have taken her best friend. She wanted him to see her. She wanted him to know that Noelle hadn't been forgotten. Miles's case took an unexpected turn when the DNA from the storage unit came back. It was a match. Miles's blood. Not enough to indicate a fatal injury, but enough to prove he'd been there, in that unit, bleeding. Police reopened the investigation with renewed urgency. They tracked down the person who'd rented the unit. The name had been fake, but the payment trail, though convoluted, led somewhere. They identified a suspect, someone with a criminal history, someone who'd been in the area at the time Miles disappeared. The suspect was brought in for questioning. He denied knowing Miles. He denied renting the storage unit. He had explanations for everything, alibis that were just credible enough to create doubt. But investigators kept digging. They found his car on traffic cameras near the parking lot where Miles's vehicle had been found. They found evidence that he'd known Miles, had been at one of his shows, had approached him afterward. The pieces were coming together slowly, painstakingly, but they were coming together. Years passed before the first body was found. Not months. Years. And the waiting during that time did something to the families that was almost worse than grief. Grief has a shape. It has stages. It moves, even if painfully, towards something resembling acceptance. But this limbo, this not knowing, it kept them frozen in the worst moment of their lives, unable to move backward or forward, just suspended in endless possibility. Lena's mother watched her granddaughter grow. The little girl stopped asking when Mommy was coming home. She started calling her grandmother Mama instead. It broke something fundamental in the older woman's heart every time she heard it. But she didn't correct her. What could she say? Your mother is missing. Your mother might be... Lena's funeral was held on a Saturday in May. The church was full. People who'd known her came. People who'd only known of her came. Her mother stood at the front and spoke about her daughter, about her laughter, about the way she loved her little girl, about the unfairness of her life being cut short. She thanked the volunteer group who'd found her. She thanked the community for never completely forgetting. And she said something that stayed with everyone who heard it. She said knowing was not the same as healing. She said she'd spent years imagining Lena alive somewhere, hoping she'd walk through the door. And now she knew the truth, and the truth was worse than anything she'd imagined. But at least she knew. At least she could say goodbye. At least her daughter wasn't lost anymore. The little girl, now old enough to understand more, but still too young to understand everything, placed a flower on her mother's casket. She didn't cry. She was too young when Lena disappeared to remember her clearly. The woman she called Mama stood beside her, tears streaming down her face, holding the child's hand, wondering how you explain to someone that they've lost something they never got to keep. Ria's ex-boyfriend finally broke. Not in a dramatic courtroom confession, but in a quiet moment during a routine interview, when the detective assigned to her case had almost given up hope. He'd been in prison for 3 years by then, serving time for the theft and stalking charges, and the weight of what he'd done had apparently become too much to carry alone. He told them where to find her. A wooded area outside the city, a place he used to go hiking, a place he'd thought was remote enough that she'd never be found. He said it had been an accident, that they'd argued, that things had gotten out of hand, that he'd panicked. The detective listening to him didn't believe the accident part. The evidence suggested planning. The phone manipulation. The social media posts. The deleted searches. These weren't the actions of someone in a panic. These were the actions of someone who'd thought through what to do after. Recovery teams were sent to the location he'd described. It took 2 days of searching, but they found her. Ria called her, who'd been trying to rebuild her life, who'd been lighter and happier in those final weeks, who'd thought she was finally free. She'd been in the ground for over 3 years. The autopsy confirmed what everyone already knew. Homicide. The details were withheld from the public, but her family was told. They learned what had been done to their daughter, and the knowing was as devastating as the finding. Her funeral was smaller than Lena's, more private. Her friends came. The ones who'd known something was wrong from the beginning, the ones who'd pushed police to keep investigating, the ones who'd never stopped believing she deserved justice. They spoke about her strength, her resilience, her ability to laugh even when things were hard. They spoke about how unfair it was that she'd finally gotten away from danger only to have it follow her. They spoke about the system that had failed her, the restraining order that hadn't protected her, the delays that had given her killer time. Her best friend, the one who'd noticed the messages were wrong, spoke last. She said Ria had taught her to pay attention to the small things, to trust her instincts, to not dismiss that feeling when something didn't add up. She said Ria would be furious that it had taken so long to find her. She said Ria would want them to be angry, to demand better, to make sure this didn't keep happening. And then she broke down crying, and the service ended in silence. The ex-boyfriend pleaded guilty to avoid trial. He was sentenced to life without parole. Ria's parents attended the sentencing. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their presence was enough. They watched him be led away in handcuffs, and it didn't feel like justice. It felt like a door closing on a room full of pain that would never empty. Noel's case moved through the system differently because there were multiple victims, multiple jurisdictions, multiple families, all demanding answers. The man arrested in connection with her disappearance was linked to 3 other missing women, all of whom had last been seen after meeting someone from a dating app, all of whom had sent final messages that sounded slightly off, all of whom had vanished without a trace. He maintained his innocence through 2 years of legal proceedings. His defense team argued the evidence was circumstantial, that deleted messages and suspicious searches didn't prove murder, that without bodies, there was no proof anyone was dead at all. But the prosecution built a methodical case. They brought in digital forensics experts who testified about the fake profiles, the photo theft, the manipulation tactics. They brought in psychologists who explained predatory behavior. They brought in the woman who'd canceled her date at the last minute and who'd been haunted ever since by the question of what she'd narrowly escaped. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, the verdict was guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Families wept. Noel's roommate, who'd attended every single day of the trial, sat frozen in her seat, unable to process that it was finally over. The judge handed down 4 consecutive life sentences, 1 for each victim, even though none of them had been found. But the prosecution had argued successfully that the pattern was undeniable, the evidence overwhelming, the conclusion inescapable. These women hadn't run away. They hadn't started new lives. They'd been taken, murdered, and hidden so well that their families might never have the closure of burial. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, called the defendant a danger to society, a predator who'd used technology to exploit the fundamental human desire for connection. Noel's parents released a statement afterward. They thanked the investigators, the prosecutors, the jury. They said they were grateful for the verdict, even though it didn't bring their daughter back. They said they hoped Noel was at peace, wherever she was. They said they'd never stop looking for her, never stop hoping that someday they'd be able to bring her home and say a proper goodbye. Her roommate started a foundation in Noel's name. It focused on online safety, on teaching people how to recognize manipulation, on advocating for better verification systems in dating apps. She gave talks at universities, at community centers, anywhere people would listen. She showed Noel's picture and told her story and said this could happen to anyone. She said being careful wasn't always enough. She said the world needed to change. Miles's case ended with an arrest and a confession. The man who'd rented the storage unit, who'd tried so hard to cover his tracks, finally admitted what had happened. He said he'd met Miles at a bar after a show. He said they'd gotten into an argument over something stupid, something he couldn't even remember clearly. He said things had escalated. He said Miles had died in his car, a fight that went too far, and he'd panicked. He'd put the body in the storage unit while he figured out what to do. He'd driven Miles's car to the parking lot, left it there with the guitar to make it look like Miles had left on foot. He'd cleaned the storage unit and disposed of the body in a way he wouldn't detail, in a location he wouldn't reveal. Miles's family begged him to tell them where. They said they deserved to bury their son. He said he didn't remember. He said it had been dark and he'd been scared and he couldn't find the place again if he tried. No one believed him. He remembered enough to hide evidence, to create a false trail, to avoid detection for years. He remembered enough to protect himself. He just wasn't willing to give Miles's family peace. The judge made note of this during sentencing. The lack of remorse, the continued cruelty, the refusal to let a grieving family have closure. He handed down the maximum sentence allowed by law. Miles's friends held a memorial concert on what would have been his 30th birthday. They played his songs. They shared stories. They cried and laughed and remembered him as he'd been, full of music and life and possibility. They said his body might be lost, but his music remained. They said he lived on in every note they played, every song they wrote, every moment they spent making art. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. Elise's trial was the last to conclude, and it was the most painful to watch because it centered on a home, a relationship, a life that had looked normal from the outside. The prosecution painted a picture of control disguised as love, of violence wrapped in intimacy, of a woman who'd seen the danger too late and tried to escape too slowly. They presented Elise's internet search history to the jury. The timeline was devastating. Searches about pregnancy complications. Searches about leaving safely. Searches about shelters that accepted pregnant women. Searches about how to hide money. Searches about what to do if someone threatens you. Each search was a window into her state of mind, a breadcrumb trail of fear that she'd left behind without knowing it would one day speak for her. Her co-workers testified about changes they'd noticed in the months before she disappeared. How she'd become quieter. How she'd stopped talking about her home life. How she'd flinched once when someone touched her shoulder unexpectedly. Small things, easy to miss in the moment, but in retrospect, they formed a pattern of someone living in fear. Her best friend from college testified about a phone call they'd had 2 weeks before Elise vanished. Elise had said she was pregnant. She'd sounded scared, not excited. When her friend asked if everything was okay, Elise had hesitated. Then she'd said yes, everything was fine, she was just tired. But her voice had trembled. Her friend had wanted to push, to ask more questions, but she'd respected Elise's privacy. Now she stood in the witness box and said she'd regret that decision for the rest of her life. The defense argued there was no body, no proof of death, no evidence of violence. They said Elise had left voluntarily, overwhelmed by the pregnancy, by the pressure, by expectations she couldn't meet. They said her partner had been supportive, loving, concerned when she disappeared. They said the prosecution's case was built on speculation and circumstantial evidence, that you couldn't convict someone of murder when you couldn't even prove the alleged victim was dead. But the prosecutor had one more piece of evidence. A recording from a neighbor's doorbell camera. It had been checked during the initial investigation and dismissed as irrelevant because it didn't show Elise leaving. But when investigators went back and looked more carefully, they found something else. Audio. A muffled argument late at night. A woman's voice saying please, saying stop, saying I need to leave. A man's voice, raised and angry. Then silence. Then the sound of something heavy being moved. Then nothing. The audio was played in court. Elise's mother broke down sobbing. The jury sat in stunned silence. The defense objected, argued the recording was unclear, that you couldn't definitively identify the voices, that it could have been anyone. But when combined with everything else, the searches, the timeline, the wiped phone, the changed behavior, it was enough. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They came back with a guilty verdict. Elise's partner showed no emotion as the verdict was read. He didn't look at her family. He didn't look at the jury. He stared straight ahead as if none of this concerned him. The judge sentenced him to life without parole. He addressed the defendant directly. He said that taking a life was heinous enough, but taking a life and then hiding the body, denying the family closure, showing no remorse, was a special kind of cruelty. He said Elise deserved better. Her unborn child deserved better. Her family deserved better. After the trial, Elise's mother gave a statement to the press. She said her daughter had been vibrant and intelligent and strong. She said Elise had made one mistake, trusting the wrong person, and it had cost her everything. She said no one should have to die for trying to leave. She said no one should have to search for years for answers that a killer could give, but chooses not to. She said she hoped Elise was at peace, wherever she was. She said she prayed she'd be found someday, so they could say goodbye properly. Then she walked away from the cameras and didn't speak publicly again. The years after the trials were strange for all the families involved. Justice had been served in the legal sense. People had been arrested, convicted, sentenced. But justice, they learned, was not the same thing as healing. It was not the same thing as closure. It was just a word people used to describe an ending that didn't feel like an ending at all. Lena's mother raised her granddaughter, who grew into a smart, serious child with her mother's eyes. The little girl asked questions as she got older. Who was my mom? What was she like? How did she die? Her grandmother answered honestly, age-appropriately, giving her pieces of the truth as she grew old enough to handle them. The child would never have memories of her mother, but she would have stories. She would have photos. She would have the knowledge that she'd been loved fiercely during the short time they'd had together. The town erected a small memorial near the river. Lena's name was engraved on a stone bench overlooking the water. People sometimes left flowers there. Sometimes her mother would find her granddaughter sitting on that bench, just looking at the water, thinking thoughts she didn't share. The older woman would sit beside her, not speaking, just being present. Some losses, she'd learned, you don't get over. You just learn to carry them. Ria's friends stayed close to her family. They visited on birthdays, on the anniversary of her death, on holidays. They shared memories. They looked through old photos. They kept her alive in conversation, refusing to let her become just a name in a news story, just a victim, just a statistic. They wanted people to remember Ria as she'd been. Funny, loyal, resilient. A person who'd survived hard things and was trying to build something better when her chance was stolen. One of her friends started volunteering at a domestic violence shelter. She said Ria would have wanted that. She said the best way to honor her was to help other women escape before it was too late. She led support groups. She answered crisis hotline calls. She sat with women who were trying to decide if they were in danger, who were questioning their own perceptions, who were afraid to leave and afraid to stay. She told them about Ria. She told them about the warning signs they'd all missed. She told them to trust their instincts. Noelle's roommate finished her degree and became a teacher. She taught computer science and made internet safety a core part of her curriculum. She didn't just teach coding. She taught her students how to protect themselves online, how to recognize manipulation, how to verify identities, how to trust their gut when something felt wrong. She showed them statistics about online predation. She showed them Noelle's picture. She said this was her best friend. She said this is why it matters. Every year on the anniversary of Noelle's disappearance, she organized a campus event. Speakers came to talk about safety, about awareness, about the responsibility of tech companies to protect users. The foundation she'd started in Noelle's name had grown, funding research, supporting families of missing persons, advocating for policy changes. It didn't bring Noelle back. Nothing could do that. But it meant her death wasn't meaningless. It meant something had changed because she'd existed and been loved and been lost. Miles's friends continued to play music. Some of them had considered quitting after he died. The joy had gone out of it. Every empty stage felt like a reminder of who should have been there. But eventually, they realized quitting would be another way of letting him disappear. So they kept playing. They dedicated songs to him. They told audiences about him. They made sure his name was remembered by people who'd never met him. One of them wrote an album about loss, about not knowing, about the specific pain of loving someone who vanished. The songs were raw and honest and hard to listen to. Critics praised them. They climbed charts. They reached people who'd experienced similar losses. The musician received messages from strangers thanking him for putting into words what they'd felt but couldn't express. Miles's parents heard the album and cried. But they also felt grateful. Their son was still here. In a way, still touching lives, still mattering. Elisa's family struggled the most with closure because they'd never found her body. The conviction had given them legal resolution, but emotionally, they were still suspended in that awful space between knowing and not knowing. They knew she was dead. They knew who'd killed her. But they didn't know where she was. They didn't know if she'd suffered. They didn't know if she'd known, in those final moments, how much they loved her. Her mother hired private investigators to continue searching. They followed every lead, checked every possible location, used every piece of technology available. Nothing. Either the killer had hidden her too well, or he destroyed the evidence so thoroughly that nothing remained to find. The mother spent her savings on the search. Her family begged her to stop, to accept what couldn't be changed, to focus on living. But she couldn't, not while there was still a chance. Years later, when the private investigator gently told her they'd exhausted every possibility, that there was nowhere left to look, she finally let herself grieve fully. She held a memorial service even though there was no body to bury. She said goodbye to a daughter who might be anywhere or nowhere. She planted a tree in her backyard with a plaque bearing Elisa's name. She told herself this was Elisa's place now, this spot where something living would grow in her memory. The convicted killers adapted to prison in different ways. Some maintained their innocence. Some stayed silent. Some expressed remorse that felt performative to the families watching. None of them revealed information that would have given their victims' families peace. They held on to that last piece of power, the knowledge of where bodies were hidden, what had really happened, why. Victim advocacy groups said this was common. Killers who hid their victims often never revealed locations. It was their final act of control. It was the one thing they had left that made them important, that kept them in the news, that gave them attention. Families learned to hate this dynamic. They learned that even in prison, even with life sentences, these men were still causing harm, still wielding power, still choosing cruelty. Some families pushed for legislation. They wanted laws that would incentivize convicted killers to reveal body location. The pattern that connected these 5 cases, the pattern that investigators had eventually identified, was trust. Not stranger danger. Not random violence. Trust weaponized. In every case, the victim had known their killer or had been made to believe they knew them. In every case, normalcy had been the disguise. In every case, the people around them hadn't seen the danger until it was too late. This realization changed how law enforcement approached missing persons cases. They started looking more carefully at intimate partners, at recent ex-boyfriends, at people who offered rides, at online connections that seemed too good to be true. They trained officers to recognize digital manipulation, to understand that a person's phone staying active didn't mean the person was safe, to move faster, investigate harder, push back against the assumption that adults who go missing chose to leave. But institutional change is slow, and even with better training, better awareness, better protocols, people still vanished. Women still trusted the wrong person. Killers still found ways to hide their crimes. The system improved, but it didn't solve the fundamental problem. The problem that people were capable of terrible things. The problem that evil often wore a familiar face. The families of the 5 victims found each other eventually. Not in person at first, but online. They joined support groups for families of homicide victims. They recognized each other's names from news coverage. They started talking privately, sharing experiences, offering understanding that no one else could provide. They talked about the guilt, the what-ifs, the anger at a system that moved too slowly, the frustration with a public that forgot too quickly. They talked about how holidays felt now, how birthdays of the dead were both unbearable and necessary to acknowledge, how they developed a kind of sixth sense for other people's grief, recognizing it instantly in strangers' eyes, how they sometimes felt like they were living in 2 worlds simultaneously, the world where their loved one was dead, and the shadow world where they were still alive, still out there, still coming home. Lena's mother talked about her granddaughter asking questions she didn't know how to answer. The child wanted to know if heaven was real, if her mom could see her, if she'd be proud of her. The grandmother said she told her yes to all of it, even though she wasn't sure herself. She said she'd give her granddaughter certainty even if she had none. Ria's father talked about the anger, how it lived in his chest like a permanent weight, how he'd wake up some mornings and for a split second forget what had happened, and then remember, and the grief would hit him fresh all over again. How he'd thought time would make it easier, but it had just made it different. The pain was still there, just worn smooth by repetition, like a stone in a river. Noelle's mother talked about the empty chair at the dinner table, how they'd stopped setting a place for her, but the absence was still there, palpable and awful. How they'd learned to talk around it, to have conversations that didn't include Noelle, but that she haunted anyway. How she sometimes caught herself about to text Noelle something funny before remembering. How her thumb would hover over her daughter's contact, and she'd have to put the phone down before she broke. Miles's mother talked about music, how she couldn't listen to it anymore. How every song reminded her of her son. How silence had become her companion. How his friends still called sometimes, checking on her, and she appreciated it, but also found it exhausting. How she'd become someone she didn't recognize, this woman shaped entirely by loss. Miles's friends organized a concert 10 years after his death. They called it Miles's Night and made it an annual event. Musicians from all over came to play. They raised money for music education programs. They shared stories. They made sure everyone in attendance knew who Miles had been and why he mattered. The venue was always packed. Music became the way his memory lived on, the most fitting tribute anyone could imagine. Elise's family never found her body. They never got to bury her. They never got answers to questions that haunted them. Her mother died 5 years after Elise disappeared. Some said of a broken heart, though the death certificate listed cancer. At her funeral, people whispered that she'd never recovered from losing her daughter, that the grief had made her sick, that she died still searching. The convicted killers remained in prison. Some filed appeals that went nowhere. Some found religion and wrote letters to families asking for forgiveness. The families didn't respond. Forgiveness wasn't something they owed. Some of the killers died in prison. Natural causes. Heart attacks. One was killed by another inmate. The families didn't celebrate these deaths, but they didn't mourn them either. Justice, they'd learned, wasn't satisfying. Revenge wasn't healing. Nothing brought their loved ones back. What emerged from these 5 cases, when you pulled back and looked at the larger picture, was a pattern that extended far beyond individual tragedies. These disappearances reflected something systemic. They revealed how violence operates in shadows, how danger hides in plain sight, how the tools meant to connect us, phones and apps and social media, could be turned into weapons, how trust, that essential human quality, could be exploited by people who understood it was easier to harm someone who believed you meant them no harm. Law enforcement agencies across the country studied these cases. They became training examples, cautionary tales, proof that initial assumptions could be deadly, that delay cost lives, that believing victims and their families from the beginning mattered. Some departments changed protocols. Others didn't. Change is uneven, dependent on leadership, funding, institutional will. But awareness had been raised. That counted for something, even if it counted for less than the families deserved. Technology companies responded to the attention these cases brought to online predation. Some dating apps implemented better verification systems. Some added safety features, panic buttons, ways to share locations with trusted contacts. Some hired teams specifically to identify fake profiles, to catch predators before they could harm anyone. But predators adapted too. They always did. For every security measure put in place, someone found a way around it. The arms race between safety and harm continued, endless and exhausting. Universities changed their orientation programs. They added sessions about personal safety, about recognizing manipulation, about what to do if a friend goes missing. They trained resident advisors to spot warning signs. They improved campus security. They installed more cameras, more emergency phones, more lights in dark places. Students complained it felt like a surveillance state. Administrators argued they were trying to prevent tragedies. Both were probably right. Community organizations started programs teaching women self-defense, not just physical techniques, but also boundary setting, threat assessment, de-escalation. The classes filled up immediately. Women came eager to learn, aware that knowledge might mean the difference between surviving and becoming a statistic. Instructors emphasized that violence wasn't victims' fault, that no amount of preparation guaranteed safety, but that information was power. The classes helped. They weren't enough, but they helped. The cultural conversation around these cases, around missing persons and violence against women generally, shifted gradually. There was more willingness to believe victims. More skepticism toward charming men with controlled exteriors. More understanding that abuse doesn't always look dramatic, that sometimes it's quiet and methodical and happens behind closed doors. More recognition that when someone says they're afraid, that fear should be taken seriously, not dismissed as overreaction. But cultural shifts are incomplete and inconsistent. For every person who learned something from these tragedies, there were others who dismissed them as isolated incidents, bad luck, poor judgment on the victim's part. Victim blaming persisted despite education efforts. The instinct to find fault with the dead rather than confront the reality of predatory behavior proved stubborn. Why did she get in that car? Why did she meet someone from the internet? Why didn't she leave sooner? These questions, asked by people who'd never faced those circumstances, missed the point entirely. The families grew tired of explaining this. Tired of defending their dead loved ones against implications they'd been foolish or careless. Their daughters, their friends, their family members had been living their lives. They'd been trusting people as humans do. They'd been navigating a world that tells women to be careful while simultaneously mocking them for being paranoid. They'd made choices that seemed reasonable at the time, and they'd paid with their lives for the cruelty of others. Lena's mother gave an interview to a national news program 10 years after her daughter's death. The reporter asked what she wanted people to know. She said she wanted them to understand that Lena hadn't done anything wrong, that accepting a ride from someone she knew wasn't reckless, that she'd been a good mother, a hard worker, a beloved daughter, that she deserved to live, that her death wasn't a lesson about women needing to be more careful. It was a lesson about people needing to stop killing women. The interview went viral. People shared it across social media. Some praised her honesty. Others criticized her for being too angry, too unwilling to acknowledge that precautions mattered. She didn't care what they thought. She'd said what needed saying. She defended her daughter against a world that wanted to blame her for her own murder. That was all that mattered. Ria's father did something similar. He wrote an op-ed for a major newspaper about his daughter's case. He talked about the restraining order that hadn't protected her, the police who'd been slow to respond when she first went missing, the assumptions that she'd left voluntarily, the days that passed before anyone took the threat seriously. He called for systemic change. He said his daughter would still be alive if the system had worked the way it should have. The op-ed sparked debate. Some agreed wholeheartedly. Others argued he was being unfair to law enforcement, that they did their best with limited resources, that hindsight made everything look clearer. But families of other victims reached out to him. They said thank you. They said someone needed to say it. They said he was right to be angry. They were angry too. Noelle's roommate wrote a book. She'd been encouraged to do so by her therapist, who thought it might be cathartic. At first, she wrote just for herself, processing her grief and guilt and anger on the page. But as the manuscript grew, she realized it might help others. She found a publisher. The book came out 3 years after the trial ended. It was part memoir, part advocacy, part manual for surviving the unsurvivable. She wrote about the red flags she'd missed, the moments when something had felt off but she dismissed it, the guilt she carried for not being more insistent that Noelle cancel her date, the anger at a killer who'd been so methodical in his deception, the frustration with a system that required bodies before it would act decisively, the slow, painful process of learning to live in a world without her best friend. The book received positive reviews. Readers called it heartbreaking and important. Sales were modest but steady. She donated the proceeds to her foundation. She did interviews, appeared on podcasts, spoke at book clubs. She talked about Noelle over and over, keeping her memory alive, turning her grief into action. It helped. Not always, not completely, but it helped. Miles's story was told through music. His friends released that album, and it found an audience beyond what anyone expected. Songs about loss resonated with people who'd experienced their own tragedies. The album became a kind of communal grieving space. People wrote to the band saying this song helped them after their father died, after their sister was killed, after their friend took their own life. Miles's absence had created something that comforted others in their absences. His friends found meaning in that. Elise's case remained open in a technical sense. Her body was still missing. Detectives continued to follow leads as they emerged, though they emerged rarely now. Her mother's death had left her siblings as the primary family members seeking answers. They were less obsessive about it, more resigned to the likelihood that they'd never know exactly where she was. They held on to the conviction, the knowledge that justice had been served legally even if closure remained elusive. The 5 cases existed in the public consciousness differently now, a decade removed from the initial disappearances. They were history, old news, part of the true crime canon that people studied and discussed and theorized about. New generations discovered them through podcasts and documentaries and articles. The victims became names without faces to most people, tragedies without the weight of reality. But to the families, they remained immediate. The grief was still fresh in the way only personal grief can be. Time hadn't diminished it, just changed its shape. The sharp, shocking pain of those first days had been replaced by a duller, constant ache. A permanent absence that colored everything. A hole in the world that would never be filled. They'd learned to function around it. They went to work. They raised children. They celebrated holidays. They found moments of joy. But the grief was always there, a companion they couldn't shake, a weight they carried everywhere. Some days it was manageable. Some days it crushed them. There was no predicting which days would be which. Anniversaries were hard. Birthdays of the dead. The dates they disappeared. The dates their bodies were found, for those whose bodies were found. The dates of arrests, trials, sentencing. Each one a marker in time that demanded acknowledgement. Some families held private remembrances. Others organized public events. Everyone coped differently. Lena's mother and granddaughter visited the memorial bench every year on the anniversary of the recovery. They brought flowers. They sat in silence. The granddaughter, now a young woman, sometimes talked to her mother, telling her about school, about friends, about life. The grandmother didn't know if she believed Lena could hear, but she believed in the ritual, the act of remembering, the refusal to let death mean erasure. Ria's friends maintained a tradition of gathering on what would have been her birthday. They went to her favorite restaurant. They ordered her favorite wine. They toasted her memory. They told stories, some funny, some sad, all of them keeping her present in conversation. They'd been doing this for years now. Some of the group had moved away, started families, changed careers. But they always came back for this. Ria deserved that loyalty. Noel's foundation held an annual gala fundraiser. It had grown into a significant event, attended by hundreds of people, raising substantial money for their programs. Noel's parents attended each year, gave speeches, thanked supporters. It was exhausting and necessary. They were proud of what had been built in their daughter's name. They just wished she could see it. Wished she could be there not as a memory, but as a living, breathing presence. Miles's night continued to draw crowds. Musicians who'd never met him came to play because they'd heard his story, because they understood the loss of a fellow artist, because music was how they processed grief. The original core of his friends was aging now, graying, dealing with their own health issues and family obligations. But they kept showing up. For Miles. For the promise they'd made to keep his memory alive. Elisa's siblings maintained her social media accounts, frozen in time. They couldn't bring themselves to delete them. Occasionally, someone new would discover the accounts and leave a comment. Rest in peace. I'm sorry this happened to you. You deserve better. The siblings read these messages and felt grateful that strangers still cared, still thought about their sister, still acknowledged her humanity. The pattern these 5 cases revealed, when examined together, was both specific and universal. Specific in the details, the particular ways trust was exploited, the individual methods of violence and concealment. But universal in what it said about human vulnerability, about the fact that no amount of caution guarantees safety, about how danger often comes from familiar sources, about how the mechanisms meant to protect us, relationships, communities, technology, can be turned against us by people who understand how they work. This pattern repeated constantly, not just in these 5 cases, but in hundreds of others across the country. Missing persons reports filed daily. Families beginning their own terrible journeys through confusion, fear, investigation, grief. The specifics varied, but the arc was familiar. The delay, the dismissal, the moment when fear was confirmed, the endless aftermath. Advocacy groups tried to break this pattern. They pushed for policy changes, faster response times, better training, more resources, Amber Alerts, but for adults, technology to track phones in real time with proper oversight, laws requiring dating apps to verify identities, protections for people trying to leave abusive relationships, funding for search and recovery efforts. Some changes happened. Others stalled in legislatures, blocked by concerns about privacy, cost, feasibility. Progress was incremental and frustrating. Activists felt like they were pushing a boulder uphill while more people disappeared, more families joined their ranks, more cases went cold. The advocates who'd emerged from these 5 cases, the family members and friends who'd turned their grief into action, found themselves becoming experts in a field they never wanted to know existed. They learned the language of law enforcement, the bureaucracy of victim services, the politics of legislative change. They networked with other families, building a community bound by shared trauma. They testified at hearings, gave interviews, wrote letters to politicians. It became their purpose, the thing that gave meaning to losses that felt meaningless. But the work was exhausting. Constantly reliving the worst moments of their lives in service of helping others avoid the same fate took a toll. Some activists burned out, needed to step back, found they couldn't keep immersing themselves in tragedy. Others kept going despite the cost, driven by a sense that stopping would dishonor their loved ones. There was no right answer. Everyone had to find their own balance between advocacy and self-preservation. Lena's mother eventually had to reduce her involvement in victims' advocacy work. Her health was declining, and she needed to focus on her granddaughter, who was entering difficult teenage years and needed stability. She felt guilty about stepping back, like she was abandoning Lena somehow. Her therapist reminded her that she'd already given more than anyone should have to give. That taking care of herself and her granddaughter was also honoring Lena's memory. That she didn't have to carry the weight of every missing person to prove her love for her daughter. Ria's father became one of the most prominent voices calling for domestic violence law reform. He spoke at conferences, worked with legislators, advised police departments on training protocols. He channeled his anger into productivity, and it worked until it didn't. His wife worried about him. He wasn't sleeping. He wasn't eating properly. He was losing himself in the work. She finally sat him down and told him that Ria wouldn't want this, wouldn't want him to destroy himself trying to save others. He broke down, admitted he didn't know how else to exist in a world without his daughter. They started couples therapy. He learned to set boundaries with the advocacy work. It remained important to him, but it couldn't be everything. Noelle's roommate, now in her 30s, found herself struggling with relationships. She'd built walls, didn't trust easily, analyzed everyone's online presence obsessively looking for red flags. Potential partners found it intense. Some understood after she explained her history. Others couldn't handle the weight of her trauma. She went through periods of isolation, convinced she was broken, that Noelle's death had damaged her too fundamentally to ever have a normal life. Therapy helped. Slowly, she learned that healing wasn't about returning to who she'd been before. It was about accepting who she'd become and building forward from there. Miles's friends dealt with survivor's guilt. Why had they lived when Miles hadn't? The question haunted them, especially during moments of success. When albums did well, when venues sold out, when life felt good, guilt would creep in. They'd been given time Miles never got. They were experiencing things he should have experienced. Their therapists told them this was normal, that they weren't dishonoring Miles by living full lives. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally were different things. Elise's siblings were navigating their own complicated grief, made more difficult by their mother's death. They'd lost a sister and then a mother, both losses tied to the same tragedy. They felt angry at Elise's killer for taking both, for creating the circumstances that had led to their mother's decline. They felt guilty for being angry at their dead sister for getting involved with such a dangerous person in the first place. They knew that was unfair, that Elise was a victim, but grief doesn't follow rules of fairness. The families had all discovered that grief makes you say and think things you wouldn't otherwise. It makes you mean and small sometimes. It makes you lash out at people who don't deserve it. It makes you blame yourself and others for things beyond anyone's control. They'd learned to forgive themselves for these moments, to understand that grief wasn't pretty or noble or even particularly rational. It was messy and complicated and sometimes ugly, and that was okay. Support groups helped with this. Being around others who understood that grief wasn't linear, wasn't resolved, wasn't something you got over, that understanding was valuable. They could say things in those groups they couldn't say anywhere else. I'm so angry at her for trusting him. I wish I'd never let him go out that night. I can't stop thinking about what her last moments were like. I feel guilty every time I laugh. I don't know how to keep living like this. These confessions were met not with judgment, but with nodding heads, with knowing looks, with yes, with me too, with I understand. The groups became safe spaces to be imperfect in their grief, to acknowledge the full range of emotions that came with loss, including the ones that felt shameful or wrong. Time continued its steady march forward. 15 years after the disappearances, then 20. The world changed around the families while their losses remained constant. Technology advanced. New apps, new platforms, new ways to connect, and new dangers that came with them. Each generation thought they were more savvy than the last, more aware of online risks. But predators evolved too. They learned the new platforms, developed new tactics, found new vulnerabilities to exploit. Young people who heard about these cases sometimes dismissed them as cautionary tales from an earlier, less sophisticated era. That couldn't happen now, they'd say. We're smarter about this stuff. We know how to spot fake profiles. We know not to meet strangers alone. But it kept happening. Different details, same pattern. Trust exploited. Violence hidden behind normalcy. Families destroyed. Lena's granddaughter, now an adult herself, worked as a counselor for at-risk youth. She'd been shaped by her mother's story in ways both obvious and subtle. She was cautious, hyper-vigilant about safety, sometimes to a degree that worried her grandmother. But she was also compassionate, especially toward young single mothers trying to make better lives for themselves. She saw her mother in them, the struggles they faced, the impossible balance of work and childcare and survival. She tried to help in ways no one had been able to help Lena. She didn't talk much about her mother publicly. The story had been told so many times that it felt like it belonged to other people now. True crime enthusiasts who discussed it endlessly online. journalists who revisited it for anniversary pieces, strangers who thought they understood her loss because they'd listened to a podcast. She kept her grief private, shared it only with people who'd earned the right to know about it. Her mother's death had shaped her, but it didn't define her. She was determined to be more than the daughter of a murdered woman. Ria's friends were in their 40s now, dealing with aging parents, growing children, career pressures. The intensity of those early years after Ria's death had faded. They still thought about her, still loved her, still missed her. But the daily sharp pain had been replaced by something more manageable. They could talk about her without crying every time. They could share funny memories without guilt. They'd learned to carry her with them rather than being crushed under the weight of her absence. One of them had a daughter who asked about Ria after finding old photos. The friend explained carefully, age-appropriately. She said Ria had been kind and funny and brave. She said sometimes bad things happen to good people. She said it wasn't fair, but it was real. The daughter asked if the bad person had been caught. The friend said yes. The daughter asked if that made it better. The friend paused, then answered honestly. "A little bit," she said, "but not really. Not enough." Noelle's foundation had expanded beyond its original mission. It now offered scholarships to students studying computer science, particularly women and minorities. It funded research into online safety. It provided grants to law enforcement agencies for technology training. It had become something substantial, something that would outlast everyone involved in its creation. Noelle's parents took comfort in that. Their daughter's name would continue to mean something, to do something, long after they were gone. The foundation hosted an annual conference that brought together law enforcement, tech companies, advocates, and families. It had become the premier event in its field, attracting hundreds of attendees. Panels discussed emerging threats, new technologies, policy recommendations. Families told their stories. Survivors shared their experiences. It was emotionally heavy but vitally important work. Noelle's roommate usually attended, though some years she couldn't. It depended on her mental health, her capacity to engage with the material, her ability to be around so much concentrated grief. She'd learned to honor her limits, to not push herself beyond what she could handle. Some years she spoke on panels. Other years she just attended sessions, absorbed information, reminded herself why the work mattered. And some years she stayed home, protected her peace, and contributed in other ways. Miles's music had found a new generation of fans. Younger musicians discovered his recordings, covered his songs, cited him as an influence. He'd been dead longer than he'd been alive now, but his work persisted. His friends found this bittersweet. Beautiful that Miles's music resonated with people who'd never met him. Painful that he'd never know about this legacy, never experienced the recognition he'd deserved while living. They'd established a scholarship in his name at his old high school for students pursuing music. Every year, they attended the award ceremony, met the recipient, heard them play. It was a way of keeping Miles's spirit alive, of investing in young talent the way people had invested in Miles when he was starting out. The recipients never knew Miles personally, but they knew his story, his music, his impact. That mattered. Elise's body was never found. Her siblings eventually accepted this as permanent reality. They'd searched for years, followed every lead, exhausted every possibility. But without cooperation from the killer, and with him maintaining silence until his death in prison, they had nothing to guide them. They held a memorial service 20 years after her disappearance, creating a marker in a cemetery where her name could be etched even if her remains couldn't be buried there. The gathering was small. Immediate family, a few close friends, her college roommate, a cousin she'd been close to. They shared memories, cried, supported each other. One of her siblings said something that resonated with everyone there. She said that Elise existed beyond her death, beyond her killer's actions, beyond the tragedy that had defined her in public consciousness. She existed in their memories, in the love they still felt for her, in the ways she'd shaped them. The killer had taken her life, but hadn't erased her existence. That was the distinction that mattered. The legal system had moved on from these cases. The trials were over. The appeals were exhausted. The killers were either imprisoned or dead. Prosecutors and defense attorneys had moved on to other cases. Judges had retired. The wheels of justice, such as they were, had turned and produced verdicts and sentences. From the system's perspective, these cases were resolved. But resolved didn't mean finished. Not for the families. Not for the communities these cases had touched. Not for the systems that had failed these 5 people in various ways. The cases lingered, instructive and haunting, examples of how things could go wrong even when people were trying to do right. Law enforcement agencies studied these cases in training sessions. They analyzed the mistakes, the missed opportunities, the assumptions that had cost time and possibly lives. They taught new officers to move faster, question harder, believe families who said something was wrong. The training was valuable, but it couldn't undo what had happened. It could only try to prevent future failures. Some of the officers who'd worked these cases carried their own guilt. The detective who'd initially dismissed Ria's friends' concerns about the text messages, who'd told them to wait, who'd lost valuable days. He'd eventually helped build the case that convicted her killer, but he couldn't forgive himself for that initial delay. He'd since become one of the most vocal advocates within his department for taking missing persons cases seriously from the first moment. The dispatcher who'd taken the call about Noelle had nightmares about it years later. She'd followed protocol, taken the information, filed the report. But she'd heard the fear in the roommate's voice and had still given the standard speech about adults having the right to go where they wanted. She wished she'd pushed harder, escalated faster, conveyed more urgency. Her supervisor told her she'd done everything right. She didn't believe him. The officer who'd first responded to Elisa's apartment, who'd walked through and seen nothing obviously wrong, who'd filed a standard missing person report and moved on to his next call. He'd testified at the trial years later, and during cross-examination, the defense had implied he'd been negligent, had missed evidence, had failed to recognize danger. The accusations weren't fair, but they haunted him. He'd followed procedure. But maybe procedure wasn't enough. Maybe it never had been. These officers weren't villains. They were people working within a system that had limitations, resource constraints, protocols that didn't account for every situation. But knowing that didn't absolve them of the feeling that they'd failed. That if they'd done something different, made different choices, trusted different instincts, maybe these 5 people would still be alive. The prosecutors who tried these cases felt their own burdens. The satisfaction of convictions was diminished by the knowledge of what had been lost. They'd won, legally speaking. They'd put dangerous people in prison. They'd given families a measure of justice. But they'd also spent months immersed in the worst details of these crimes, had learned intimate facts about violence and cruelty that they couldn't unknow. The work had cost them something too. One prosecutor left criminal law entirely after Noelle's case concluded. She said she couldn't do it anymore, couldn't bear another trial, another family's devastation, another victim's story. She went into civil practice, handled contract disputes and business litigation, things that didn't involve human suffering. Her colleagues understood. Some stayed in criminal law because they felt called to it. Others left because they couldn't sustain the emotional toll. The defense attorneys faced their own complicated feelings. They'd done their jobs, provided the constitutionally required representation, ensured their clients received fair trials. But defending people they believed had committed terrible crimes took a toll. Some compartmentalized successfully, separating the professional duty from personal feelings. Others struggled with knowing they'd fought to free people they suspected were guilty, even if ultimately unsuccessful. One defense attorney who'd represented Ria's ex-boyfriend retired early. He told colleagues he was done, that he couldn't look at another autopsy photo, couldn't cross-examine another grieving family member, couldn't argue that his client deserved benefit of doubt when he privately believed they deserved nothing of the kind. He understood the importance of the adversarial system, believed in it theoretically, but practically, emotionally, he was finished. The judges who'd overseen these trials carried their own weight. They'd heard every detail, seen every piece of evidence, watched families break down in their courtrooms. They'd had to remain impartial, controlled, focused on law rather than emotion. But they were human. The cases affected them. Some had trouble sleeping after particularly graphic testimony. Some went home and held their own children tighter, grateful and guilty for their safety. The juries in these cases experienced their own trauma. They'd been selected as ordinary citizens called to perform an extraordinary duty. They'd sat through weeks or months of testimony. They'd examined evidence that would haunt some of them forever. They'd deliberated, argued, reached verdicts that would affect multiple lives. And then they'd been dismissed, sent back to their regular lives, expected to simply move on. But you don't move on from that. Not easily. Jury duty for a murder trial changes you. Several jurors from these cases sought therapy afterward. They had nightmares. They struggled with anxiety. They questioned their own decisions, wondered if they'd gotten it right, if they'd truly understood all the evidence, if their verdict had been just. The system asked so much of them and then offered little support once they delivered. One juror from Elise's trial said in an interview years later that she thought about the case almost daily. She said she'd never forget the recording of Elise saying please, saying stop. She said she'd voted guilty with certainty, but that the certainty hadn't brought peace. She said she wished Elise's body had been found, that the family had gotten that closure. She said being a juror had made her understand that justice was more complicated than she'd realized, less satisfying, less clean. The communities where these disappearances occurred also carried the weight. Small towns especially felt the impact. Lena's river town never quite shook the shadow of what happened. The river itself became a place of sadness rather than recreation. Property values near it declined. Families who'd loved going there stopped. The memorial bench was visited regularly, but the rest of the riverbank felt haunted. Local businesses suffered. The diner where Lena had worked closed a few years after her death. The owner said it wasn't because of what happened, but everyone knew better. Customers had stopped coming as frequently. The association was too strong. Every time someone sat in the booth Lena used to serve, they thought about her. It became a place of mourning rather than comfort. The town where Rhea had lived experienced something similar. People moved away. Those who stayed talked about before and after, meaning before Rhea disappeared and after. The community that had felt safe suddenly didn't. Parents kept children closer. Women walked in groups. The coffee shop where Rhea used to go on Sundays put up her picture, a memorial that remained years later. New residents would ask about it, and longtime residents would tell the story again, keeping her memory alive, but also keeping the trauma present. Universities where cases like Noelle's occurred struggled with their responses. They wanted to support students, provide resources, maintain safety. But they also worried about reputation, about enrollment numbers, about lawsuits. The balance between genuine care and institutional protection was difficult to navigate. Some schools did better than others. Some made meaningful changes to safety protocols and support services. Others made superficial gestures that looked good in press releases, but didn't substantially help students. Noelle's University created a new position, a victim advocate specifically for missing persons cases. The person hired for it worked closely with families, helped them navigate university bureaucracy, connected them with resources, liaised with law enforcement. It was meaningful work, though emotionally draining. The advocate left after 3 years, burned out from vicarious trauma. The position remained, filled by others who came with fresh energy and left exhausted. The dating apps implicated in cases like Noelle's faced public pressure, but limited legal liability. They implemented safety features as mentioned before, but also included extensive terms of service protecting themselves from lawsuits. They couldn't be held responsible for what users did with their platforms, legally speaking. But morally, ethically, the question was more complex. How much responsibility did they bear for creating spaces where predators could hunt? Some apps took the question seriously, invested genuinely in safety features and verification systems. Others did the minimum required to avoid bad press. Tech companies, like all companies, varied in their ethics and priorities. The families of victims wanted more accountability, stronger regulations, mandatory verification. Tech companies argued for free speech, privacy rights, innovation over regulation. The debate continued without resolution. Online communities that discussed true crime had their own complicated relationship with these cases. The best discussions focused on systemic issues, on what could be learned, on honoring victims' humanity. The worst turned victims into characters, crimes into entertainment, families' pain into content for consumption. The line between education and exploitation was thin and frequently crossed. Lena's mother had once made the mistake of reading comments on a true crime forum discussing her daughter's case. The casual way strangers speculated about Lena's final moments, debated whether she'd fought back, criticized her for accepting a ride, treated her death as a puzzle to solve rather than a life lost. She'd felt sick reading it, violated in a way she hadn't expected. She never looked again. Rhea's friends had similar experiences. They'd found a podcast episode about Rhea's case that got basic facts wrong, that mispronounced her name, that spent more time on the killer's psychology than on who Rhea had been as a person. They'd left comments correcting the errors. Some were acknowledged. Others were ignored. They realized they had no control over how Rhea's story was told, how she was remembered by strangers, how her death was used. Noelle's roommate had been approached multiple times by people wanting to make documentaries, write books, create podcasts about Noelle's case. Most she declined. A few she agreed to after extensive vetting. She tried to maintain some control over the narrative, to ensure Noelle was portrayed as a full person rather than just a victim. It was exhausting work that she resented having to do. But the alternative, letting Noelle's story be told by people who'd never known her, felt worse. Miles's friends had been more open to media coverage, perhaps because his case had received less attention overall. They wanted people to know about him, to hear his music, to understand what had been lost. But they also encountered the same issues. Journalists who cared more about the mystery than the man. Podcasters who sensationalized details. Internet sleuths who developed elaborate theories that were both wrong and disrespectful. One particularly painful experience involved a true crime YouTuber who'd made a video about Miles's disappearance filled with speculation and inaccuracies. His friends had asked for it to be taken down. The YouTuber had refused, citing free speech. The video remained up, generating ad revenue from Miles's tragedy. His friends learned they were powerless to stop it. The law protected the YouTuber more than it protected their friend's memory. Elise's siblings had avoided all true crime media about her case. They didn't want to hear strangers discuss their sister. Didn't want to see her intimate searches about leaving made public. Didn't want her fear commodified. They'd made peace with the fact that they couldn't control the narrative. They just opted out of engaging with it entirely. The passage of time created a strange distance between the victims and the public memory of them. 25 years after the disappearances, Lena, Rhea, Noelle, Miles, and Elise had been dead longer than some of them had been alive. New generations learned their stories without context, without the visceral fear their cases had generated when they were current news. They became historical, educational, examples in textbooks and training materials and warning stories told to children. The families watched this transformation with mixed feelings. On one hand, their loved ones were being remembered, their stories still told, their names not completely forgotten. On the other hand, the emotional reality of what had happened, the rawness of the loss, the ongoing nature of the grief, these things were flattened in the retelling. The victims became symbols, lessons, cautionary tales. Their humanity was preserved in some ways and lost in others. Lena's granddaughter, now middle-aged herself with children of her own, had a complicated relationship with her mother's legacy. She told her own children about Lena, showed them pictures, shared stories she'd been told since she had no memories of her own. But she also felt protective of her mother's memory, defensive when people treated Lena as just another victim in just another case. Lena had been a person. She'd been someone's daughter, someone's mother, someone's friend. She deserved to be remembered as more than a tragedy. She'd written an essay once, unpublished, about what it meant to grow up as the child of a murdered woman. About how people treated her differently when they learned her story. About how some were overly sympathetic, others morbidly curious, still others awkward and uncomfortable. About how she'd learned to protect herself by being selective about who she told. About how her mother's absence had shaped her entire life, even though she'd never really known her. The essay sat in a drawer. She'd shown it to her therapist, to her spouse, to a few trusted friends. But she'd never published it because she didn't want to invite public scrutiny, didn't want strangers analyzing her grief, didn't want to become part of the true crime content ecosystem. Her mother's story belonged to others now, but her own grief was still hers. She guarded it carefully. Rhea's friends, now in their 50s and 60s, still gathered annually, though the gatherings had changed. They talked less about Rhea's death and more about her life. They shared memories that had nothing to do with how she died and everything to do with how she'd lived. They showed their children pictures of Rhea, told stories, kept her present across generations. The grief had become integrated into their lives rather than dominating them. It was there, always, but it no longer consumed them. One of them had kept every letter she and Rhea had exchanged in college. Old-fashioned handwritten letters, before email became ubiquitous, before texting existed. She'd reread them recently and been struck by how young they'd been. how full of hope and uncertainty and big dreams. Ria had written about wanting to travel, to make a difference, to find love that felt safe. She'd gotten so little time to pursue any of it. The friend had considered donating the letters to an archive, thinking they might be valuable for researchers studying the case or the era. But ultimately, she couldn't. The letters were too personal, too intimate. They belonged to the friendship she and Ria had shared, not to history or scholarship or public consumption. She kept them in a box, took them out occasionally, remembered her friend as she'd been, young and alive and full of possibility. Noelle's foundation continued its work, now run by people who'd never known Noelle personally. The original board members had aged out or moved on. New leadership had taken over, bringing fresh energy and ideas. The foundation's mission had evolved, expanded, adapted to new technologies and new threats. It was successful by any measure. It had helped thousands of people, changed policies, saved lives. But something had been lost in the transition. The new board members knew Noelle's story, but they didn't know Noelle. She was a name to them, an inspiration, a symbol, not a person they'd loved and lost. Noelle's parents, elderly now and in declining health, attended the annual gala when they could, but they felt increasingly like guests at an event that had outgrown them. They were proud of what the foundation had become. They just sometimes missed when it had been smaller, more intimate, more directly connected to their daughter. Noelle's roommate, now in her 50s, had stepped back from active involvement years ago. She stayed on the board in an advisory capacity, but didn't attend many meetings. She'd given decades to the work and needed to focus on her own life, her own family, her own healing. She felt guilty about this sometimes, like she was abandoning Noelle. But her therapist had helped her understand that she'd given more than enough, that she was allowed to prioritize her own well-being, that Noelle would have wanted that for her. She'd written in her journal once that the hardest part wasn't the grief itself, but the way it changed over time. The way it became less sharp, but also less immediate. The way Noelle's face became harder to picture clearly. The way memories started to feel unreliable, like they might be partially constructed rather than purely remembered. The way time insisted on moving forward even when she wanted to stay frozen in a moment when Noelle was still alive. Miles's music had achieved a kind of cult status. He was referenced by contemporary artists. His songs were covered frequently. A documentary about his life and mysterious death had been released a few years ago, well-made and respectful, focusing more on his artistry than his murder. His friends had cooperated with it, grateful for the opportunity to share who Miles had really been. The documentary had introduced his music to new audiences, and streaming numbers had increased significantly. But success came with complications. People now argued about what Miles would have wanted, what he would have thought about modern music, how he would have evolved as an artist. These debates frustrated his friends because no one could actually know. Miles had been frozen in time at a moment when he was still developing, still figuring out his sound, still growing. Treating him as a finished artist, a complete legacy, felt wrong. He'd been a person in process, and death had interrupted that process violently. His parents had both passed away, his father a decade ago, his mother just last year. At her funeral, Miles's friends played some of his songs. They talked about how his mother had kept his room exactly as he'd left it for years before finally packing things up. They shared how she'd never stopped hoping that somehow, impossibly, he'd come home. How she'd known intellectually that he was gone, but emotionally couldn't fully accept it. How she died still carrying that hope and that grief. The musician who'd written the album about Miles spoke at the funeral. He said Miles's mother had been one of the strongest people he'd ever met. That she'd lost her son in the worst possible way and had still found reasons to smile, to be kind, to invest in other people's children. That she'd supported his music even when it was difficult to listen to because it was about her loss. That she'd told him once that keeping Miles's memory alive through music was the greatest gift anyone could give her. Elisa's siblings were the last remaining family members actively invested in her case. Their parents were dead. Other relatives had moved on or passed away. Just the siblings remained, now in their 60s, still without a body, still without complete answers. They'd made peace with never finding her in the way peace is possible when you've exhausted all other options. They'd scattered symbolic ashes in places Elise had loved, even though they weren't really her ashes, just a way of marking her memory. They rarely talked about the case publicly anymore. They'd said everything there was to say. They'd given interviews, written victim impact statements, attended every parole hearing even though the killer wasn't eligible for parole. They'd done their duty to Elise's memory. Now they just wanted to live what remained of their own lives without being defined entirely by their sister's murder. One of them had grandchildren who knew about Elise only as Anne Elise, who died before we were born. The details had been shared age-appropriately, sanitized for young ears. The grandchildren knew their great-aunt had been killed by a bad person. They knew it was sad. They knew their grandparents still missed her. But it wasn't real to them the way it was real to their elders. It was history, distant and abstract. This generational distance was both painful and necessary. Painful because it meant Elise was being forgotten in some fundamental way. Necessary because the children deserved to grow up without being burdened by trauma that wasn't theirs. The balance between remembering and moving forward was delicate, different for each family member, renegotiated constantly. The 5 cases, when examined from a distance of decades, revealed patterns that extended beyond the individual tragedies. They revealed how society responds to violence against women, how quickly attention fades, how cases involving attractive young white women receive more coverage than others, how marginalized victims are overlooked, how the system fails consistently and predictably. Advocates had used these cases to push for change, and some change had occurred. Missing persons protocols had improved. Technology had advanced. Awareness had increased. But fundamental problems remained. Women still disappeared. Killers still exploited trust. Families still fought for attention and resources. The system still moved too slowly, still made assumptions, still prioritized some victims over others. Lena, Rhea, Noelle, Miles, and Elise had all been, in various ways, sympathetic victims. Young, promising, from families that had resources and time to search. Their cases had received attention partly because of who they were and how they looked and what their families could mobilize. But for every case like theirs that made headlines, dozens of others barely registered. Missing Indigenous women, homeless individuals, sex workers, undocumented immigrants, LGBTQ youth, people whose disappearances were treated as less urgent, less worthy, less real. This disparity haunted the families who'd received attention. They knew they'd been lucky, in a terrible way, to have their loved ones' cases taken seriously. They knew others weren't as lucky. Some had tried to use their platforms to advocate for all missing persons, not just ones who looked like their loved ones. Others felt they could barely handle their own grief, couldn't take on the additional weight of systemic injustice. There was no right answer. Everyone did what they could with what they had. Some became activists for broader change. Others focused narrowly on their own cases. Some burned out and stepped away entirely. All were valid responses to impossible circumstances. Grief and trauma don't create obligations. People were allowed to protect themselves, to prioritize their own healing, to say no to requests for their time and energy. The media landscape had changed dramatically over the decades since these disappearances first occurred. When Lena vanished, social media was in its infancy. Information spread through local news, word of mouth, physical posters. By the time the last trial concluded, the internet had transformed how cases were covered and discussed. Now, another decade beyond that, the ecosystem was unrecognizable from what it had been. This evolution brought benefits and costs. Information traveled faster. More people could be reached with appeals for help. Digital forensics had become sophisticated, often crucial to investigations. But the speed and reach also meant misinformation spread rapidly. Armchair detectives interfered with investigations, and victims' families faced harassment from online trolls who questioned everything from their grief to their motives. Lena's granddaughter had dealt with conspiracy theorists who claimed her grandmother had been involved in Lena's death, that the whole case had been covered up, that the truth was something other than what the evidence showed. These theories had no basis in fact, but they circulated anyway, immune to correction. She'd learned not to engage, not to read comments, not to let strangers' delusions affect her. But it was exhausting knowing these false narratives existed, that people were profiting from them through YouTube videos and blog posts. Rhea's friends had encountered similar issues. Internet sleuths who decided her ex-boyfriend was innocent, that the conviction was a miscarriage of justice, that the real killer was still out there. They created elaborate alternative theories, dissected trial transcripts, found supposed inconsistencies in the evidence. Never mind that a jury had heard all this evidence and reached a verdict. Never mind that Ria's friends who'd known her and known him had no doubt about his guilt. The online theorists knew better, or thought they did. These armchair investigators saw themselves as truth seekers, as advocates for justice. They didn't see or didn't care about the harm they caused. About families forced to relive trauma when old cases were rehashed. About how their just asking questions approach gave platforms to baseless accusations. About how their content, monetized through ads and sponsors, profited from real people's pain. Noelle's roommate had gone so far as to hire a lawyer to send cease and desist letters to several content creators who'd made particularly egregious videos about Noelle's case. Some complied. Others fought back, claiming First Amendment protections. The lawyers said they could pursue further legal action, but it would be costly and the outcome uncertain. She'd had to decide whether fighting was worth the emotional and financial cost. Eventually, she'd chosen to let it go, to focus her energy elsewhere. Miles's friends had tried a different approach. When they found inaccurate or disrespectful content about his case, they posted corrections in comments, trying to set the record straight. Sometimes it worked. Often it didn't. They learned that once false information was out there, it took on a life of its own. People believed what fit their existing narratives, what made the story more interesting, what satisfied their need for conspiracy and hidden truth. One friend had written an impassioned post on social media about the harm these content creators caused. She'd explained that Miles wasn't a character in their mystery story. He'd been a real person with people who loved him. That his mother had died without ever knowing what happened to him. And internet theories hadn't helped. They'd only added to her pain. That if people genuinely cared about justice, they'd respect the families instead of treating them like obstacles to overcome in pursuit of clicks. The post went viral. Thousands shared it. Many people expressed support, said they'd never thought about it that way, promised to be more mindful. But the content creators largely ignored it. New videos and podcasts about these cases continued to be made. The cycle continued. The friend realized she couldn't stop it, could only continue speaking truth, and hope some people listened. Elise's siblings had taken the most extreme approach. They'd essentially disappeared from public view. They didn't do interviews. They didn't engage with media. They'd asked to be left alone, and mostly, people respected that. Occasionally, a journalist would track them down, leave a message asking for comment on an anniversary or a new development. They never responded. Their silence was their boundary, and they maintained it fiercely. One of them had changed her last name, not out of shame, but out of a desire for privacy, for separation from the constant association with tragedy. She wanted to be known for herself, not as the sister of a murdered woman. She wanted her children to grow up without that shadow. Some family members understood. Others felt hurt, as if she were trying to erase Elise. She'd explained that wasn't it at all. She loved her sister. She just needed some distance from the public aspects of the case. They'd eventually understood, or at least accepted it. The criminal justice system that had processed these cases had itself evolved over the decades. New technologies emerged. DNA analysis became more sophisticated. Digital forensics developed into an entire field. Cold case units were established in departments that could afford them. Some old cases were reopened and solved using new methods. But resources remained limited. Not every case could be prioritized. Not every family got answers. The officers and prosecutors and judges who'd worked these cases retired. New generations took their places, trained on lessons learned from past failures, including these 5 cases. The training was valuable. But each new generation also had to learn through experience that nothing prepared you for the human reality of these cases. For sitting across from a mother who just wanted to know where her daughter was. For telling a family that despite your best efforts, you had nothing new to tell them. Some of the evidence from these cases sat in storage facilities, archived according to retention policies. Blood samples, DNA profiles, clothing, personal effects. Physical reminders that these had been real crimes with real victims. Occasionally, someone would request access for research purposes or media production. The requests were evaluated case by case. Some families said yes, hoping it might help. Others said no, wanting their loved ones left in peace. Lena's mother, before she died, had made arrangements for what should happen to Lena's belongings. Some things went to her granddaughter. Others were donated. A few items, things Lena had treasured, were buried with her grandmother so they could be together. The granddaughter respected these decisions, even though she would have liked to keep more. She understood that her grandmother needed to let go, needed to die knowing she'd done right by her daughter's memory. Ria's belongings had been divided among family and friends. Her parents had kept her journals, too private to share, but too precious to discard. Her best friend had taken some of her clothes, wore them occasionally as a way of keeping Ria close. Other items were donated to domestic violence shelters, a way of helping other women in Ria's name. Her family found some comfort in knowing Ria's things were still in use, still serving a purpose, rather than sitting in storage or thrown away. Noelle's roommate had kept very little. She'd taken one sweater, Noelle's favorite, that still smelled like her perfume for years afterward. The scent eventually faded, and the sweater became just a sweater, but she kept it anyway. Noelle's parents had packed up her dorm room, sorted through her belongings with tears streaming down their faces. They'd kept what felt important and donated the rest. Years later, they'd gone through things again, keeping less this time, learning to hold on to Noelle without needing to hold on to every physical reminder of her. Miles's possessions had been few. He'd lived simply, owned little. His guitars, his most valuable possessions, were distributed among his musician friends with his parents' blessing. They played them, kept them in good condition, passed them on to worthy students when age made playing difficult. Miles's guitars were still making music, still bringing joy, still doing what they'd been made to do. His friends found poetry in that. Elisa's belongings had been more complicated because her partner, her killer, had technically had legal claim to shared possessions. The court had sorted through what belonged to whom, what could be given to her family, what remained in legal limbo. Her siblings had wanted very little from the apartment she'd shared with him. It all felt contaminated, tainted by association. They'd taken photos, some jewelry, a few books. The rest they'd left behind, wanting no connection to the place where she'd been afraid. The homes and apartments where these 5 people had lived had all changed hands multiple times. New occupants had moved in, unaware or unconcerned about what had happened there. Real estate disclosure laws varied by state. Some required sellers to disclose if a death had occurred in a property. Others didn't. Most of these locations weren't death sites anyway. They were just places where the victims had lived, had been happy or unhappy, had made plans for futures that never materialized. Lena's old apartment had been torn down years ago, replaced by new construction. The building where she'd lived no longer existed. In a way, this felt appropriate to her daughter. The physical space associated with her mother's last normal days was gone, transformed into something new. It felt like permission to move forward, to not be stuck in the past. Ria's apartment had been renovated, rented to new tenants who knew nothing of its history. One of her friends had driven by once, years later, and been startled to see children playing in the yard, their mother watching from the porch. Life had continued. The space held no memory of what had happened there. It was just an apartment again, shelter for a family, unremarkable and ordinary. Noelle's dorm had been demolished and replaced with a newer building. The university had been renovating campus extensively, and her building was old, scheduled for replacement anyway. There was no memorial in the new building, no plaque or marker. Just a new structure where students lived and studied and had no idea that decades earlier, one of their predecessors had lived there too before vanishing forever. Miles's apartment building still stood, but had been converted to condos. His unit had been gutted and renovated, all traces of his occupancy erased. Someone lived there now who'd never heard his name, who slept where he'd slept, who looked out windows he'd looked out, who existed in that space without any connection to its past. Elisa's apartment was the only one that had gained a certain notoriety. The address had been published during the trial. True crime enthusiasts sometimes drove by, took photos, posted them online. The building management had considered changing the numbering system to stop this, but never did. Current residents dealt with occasional unwanted attention, strangers pausing outside, looking up at windows, imagining horrors. It was invasive and uncomfortable, but there was little to be done about it. The physical spaces had moved on, but the emotional spaces remained. These cases existed in a kind of permanent present tense for those most affected. New details rarely emerged after so many years. The stories were essentially complete, the narratives fixed. But for the families, the grief remained active, evolving but never resolved. The question of how to remember became more complicated as the decades passed. Memory required maintenance, deliberate effort. Without that effort, even the most significant events faded into obscurity. The families knew this and struggled with it. They felt responsible for keeping their loved ones' memories alive, but they also grew tired of the work it required, of repeating the same stories, of correcting the same misconceptions, of fighting against the natural human tendency to forget. Lena's granddaughter had created a private memorial website, password protected, accessible only to family and close friends. She posted photos there, stories her grandmother had told her, memories from people who'd known Lena. It was a living document, growing slowly as people contributed. She'd thought about making it public, but decided against it. This space was for people who'd loved Lena, not for strangers who were merely curious. She updated it on Lena's birthday each year, adding new photos of herself and her children, telling her mother about their lives. She knew it was a one-sided conversation, knew Lena couldn't read any of it, but the ritual mattered. It was a way of maintaining connection across the boundary of death, of refusing to let that boundary mean total separation. Her children asked her sometimes why she did this, why she talked to someone who couldn't hear. She explained that memory was a kind of conversation, that we keep the dead alive by continuing to include them in our stories, by speaking to them even in their absence. The children didn't fully understand, but they participated in the ritual, adding their own messages to a grandmother they'd never meet. Ria's friends had created a scholarship fund at their high school in her name. Every year, they awarded it to a student who demonstrated resilience in the face of adversity. The selection committee read essays from applicants who'd overcome challenges, who'd shown strength when things were difficult. Reading these essays was emotionally difficult, but also meaningful. It connected Ria's memory to young people's futures, to possibilities and hope rather than just tragedy. The annual award ceremony became a gathering point for Ria's friends and family. They watched the recipient receive the award, heard them speak about their plans, saw in them the future Ria never got. Some years this was comforting. Other years it was devastating, a sharp reminder of all Ria had lost. But they continued the tradition because it honored who she'd been, someone who'd survived hard things, and who would have wanted to help others do the same. One recipient, years after receiving the award, had tracked down Ria's best friend to thank her personally. She said the scholarship had made college possible, that she'd graduated, that she was now a social worker helping young women escape domestic violence. She said she thought about Ria often, about what had happened to her, about how she wanted to honor that memory through her work. The best friend had cried listening to this, grateful that Ria's death had contributed to this woman's ability to help others live. Noelle's foundation remained the most visible memorial, the one that reached the most people. But as mentioned earlier, it had grown beyond Noelle herself, become its own entity with its own mission. This was good, necessary even. But it meant that Noelle the person sometimes got lost in Noelle the symbol, the name on the letterhead, the face in the promotional materials. Her parents had tried to combat this by insisting that every annual gala include a segment where someone who'd actually known Noelle spoke about her. Not about her death, but about her life. About her laugh, her curiosity, her kindness. About the person she'd been when she was just a college student trying to figure out her place in the world. These moments were brief, but powerful. A reminder that all the work the foundation did existed because a real person had been loved and lost. As Noelle's parents aged and eventually would pass away, the question of who would maintain this personal connection became pressing. Her roommate had agreed to continue sharing memories as long as she was able. After that, the foundation would need to decide whether to maintain this tradition with someone who'd never known Noelle personally, or whether to let that element of the gala evolve into something else. There was no perfect answer. Miles's legacy lived most fully in his music, which was fitting. Musicians still played his songs, still cited him as an influence. A biography had been published a few years ago, thoroughly researched, respectful of his artistry and his family's pain. It introduced Miles to new audiences, contextualized his work within the broader musical landscape of his time, and treated his death as a tragedy rather than a mystery to be solved. His friends had cooperated with the biographer, providing interviews, access to materials, their own memories and insights. The process had been difficult, forcing them to revisit painful history, but the result felt worth it. The book portrayed Miles as they'd known him, as a talented musician and a good person whose life had been stolen. It didn't sensationalize his death or speculate endlessly about unsolved aspects of the case. It honored him. The biographer had asked each friend the same question at the end of their interviews. What do you want people to remember about Miles? Their answers varied but shared common themes. His passion for music, his kindness, his authenticity, his potential, the person he was rather than just how he died. The biographer had woven these perspectives throughout the book, ensuring Miles's humanity remained central. Elise's memory was maintained most privately of all. Her siblings rarely spoke about her publicly, but they thought about her constantly. They visited her memorial stone on her birthday. They included her in family trees and genealogies, making sure future generations would know she'd existed. They told their children about her, carefully, age-appropriately, honestly. One sibling had written down everything she remembered about Elise, every story, every detail, everything their parents had said about her before they died. She'd created a document that could be passed down, ensuring that even as living memory faded, some record of who Elise had been would remain. It wasn't comprehensive. Memory is selective and fallible. But it was something, a testament that Elise had lived, had mattered, had been loved. The document included mundane details that might seem unimportant, but that captured Elise's personhood. Her favorite foods, the way she laughed, how she liked her coffee, the books she'd loved, the career ambitions she'd held, the dreams she'd had for her child. These small facts felt sacred because they were true, because they brought Elise into focus as a complete person rather than just a victim. The broader cultural memory of these cases had calcified into simplified narratives. Each case had been reduced to a few key facts, a brief summary, a lesson or warning. The complexity, the full humanity of everyone involved, the nuanced reality of what had happened and why, these things were lost in the reduction. The cases became examples, teaching tools, content for consumption. This bothered the families, but they also understood its inevitability. Cultural memory requires simplification. Details get lost. Context fades. What remains is the essence, the core story, which serves its purpose even if it doesn't capture everything. They couldn't control this process, couldn't prevent their loved ones from becoming symbols. They could only try to maintain fuller, richer memories among those who cared enough to look deeper. Educational materials about these cases varied in quality. Some were thoughtful, well-researched, respectful of victims and families. Others were exploitative, sensationalistic, more interested in shock value than truth. Law enforcement training materials tended toward the former. Popular media tended toward the latter. The families had no control over which was which, no way to prevent their loved ones' stories from being used in ways they wouldn't have chosen. A criminology textbook had used Noelle's case as an example of online predation. The section was factual and educational, focusing on patterns and prevention rather than gratuitous details. Noelle's parents had been informed and had approved the inclusion. They felt it served a purpose, helped educate future law enforcement officers and researchers. It was a good use of their daughter's story. Conversely, a true crime television show had done a sensationalistic episode about Ria's case years ago, against her family's wishes. They'd focused on dramatic recreations of her murder, speculated about her final moments, interviewed people who'd barely known her. The family had been devastated. They'd complained to the network, but the episode remained available on streaming platforms, continuing to cause harm long after its initial broadcast. These contradictions, the good uses and bad uses of their loved ones' stories, were impossible to reconcile. The families had to live with the fact that they'd lost control of the narratives, that their loved ones existed in public consciousness in ways both honoring and violating. It was one more loss layered on top of all the others, one more thing taken from them without consent. The question of meaning haunted everyone touched by these cases. Did these deaths mean something? Could meaning be found or created in such senseless losses? Or was searching for meaning just a coping mechanism, a way of making the unbearable slightly more bearable? Some family members found meaning through advocacy, through believing their loved ones' deaths had sparked changes that saved other lives. This gave them purpose, helped them feel their grief, served some function beyond just pain. Others rejected this entirely, felt that their loved ones' deaths were simply terrible and wrong and shouldn't have to mean anything beyond that. Both perspectives were valid. Lena's granddaughter fell into the latter camp. She didn't need her mother's death to have a purpose. It was just a tragedy, an injustice, a permanent wound. Her mother's life had meaning. Her death was just death. She lived her own life in a way she hoped would make her mother proud, but not because she felt obligated to give her mother's death meaning. Just because she loved her mother and wanted to honor that love. Ria's father, conversely, needed the advocacy work to survive his grief. He needed to believe that speaking out about domestic violence, pushing for better laws, sharing Ria's story might save someone else's daughter. Without that belief, the loss felt too vast, too pointless. The meaning he created wasn't false. His work had helped people, but it was also a lifeline for him, a way to stay afloat in his grief. Noelle's roommate had gone back and forth over the years. Sometimes she believed the Foundation's work gave Noelle's death meaning. Other times she thought that was a comforting lie, that nothing could justify or redeem the loss of her friend. She'd learned to hold both truths simultaneously. The work mattered and helped people. Noelle's death was still a senseless tragedy. Both could be true. Miles's friends found meaning in continuing to play his music, in keeping his artistic legacy alive. They believed Miles would have wanted that, would have been honored by it. But they also knew that Miles would have preferred to be alive, creating his own music, building his own legacy. The meaning they'd found didn't erase the fundamental wrongness of his death. Elise's siblings mostly avoided the question of meaning. They'd lost their sister and then their parents. They'd lived through years of investigation and trial and aftermath. They were tired of analyzing it, of trying to extract lessons or purpose from it. Sometimes, they'd concluded, terrible things just happen. Not everything has to mean something. Some losses are just losses. The question of how to remember became more complicated as the decades passed. Memory required maintenance, deliberate effort. Without that effort, even the most significant events faded into obscurity. The families knew this and struggled with it. They felt responsible for keeping their loved ones' memories alive, but they also grew tired of the work it required. Of repeating the same stories, of correcting the same misconceptions, of fighting against the natural human tendency to forget. Lena's granddaughter had created a private memorial website, password protected, accessible only to family and close friends. She posted photos there, stories her grandmother had told her, memories from people who'd known Lena. It was a living document, growing slowly as people contributed. She'd thought about making it public, but decided against it. This space was for people who'd loved Lena, not for strangers who were merely curious. She updated it on Lena's birthday each year, adding new photos of herself and her children, telling her mother about their lives. She knew it was a one-sided conversation, knew Lena couldn't read any of it, but the ritual mattered. It was a way of maintaining connection across the boundary of death, of refusing to let that boundary mean total separation. Her children asked her sometimes why she did this, why she talked to someone who couldn't hear. She explained that memory was a kind of conversation, that we keep the dead alive by continuing to include them in our stories, by speaking to them even in their absence. The children didn't fully understand, but they participated in the ritual, adding their own messages to a grandmother they'd never meet. Ria's friends had created a scholarship fund at their high school in her name. Every year, they awarded it to a student who demonstrated resilience in the face of adversity. The selection committee read essays from applicants who'd overcome challenges, who'd shown strength when things were difficult. Reading these essays was emotionally difficult, but also meaningful. It connected Ria's memory to young people's futures, to possibilities and hope rather than just tragedy. The annual award ceremony became a gathering point for Ria's friends and family. They watched the recipient receive the award, heard them speak about their plans, saw in them the future Ria never got. Some years this was comforting. Other years it was devastating, a sharp reminder of all Ria had lost. But they continued the tradition because it honored who she'd been, someone who'd survived hard things, and who would have wanted to help others do the same. One recipient, years after receiving the award, had tracked down Ria's best friend to thank her personally. She said the scholarship had made college possible, that she'd graduated, that she was now a social worker helping young women escape domestic violence. She said she thought about Ria often, about what had happened to her, about how she wanted to honor that memory through her work. The best friend had cried listening to this, grateful that Ria's death had contributed to this woman's ability to help others live. Noel's foundation remained the most visible memorial, the one that reached the most people. But as mentioned earlier, it had grown beyond Noel herself, become its own entity with its own mission. This was good, necessary even. But it meant that Noel the person sometimes got lost in Noel the symbol, the name on the letterhead, the face in the promotional materials. Her parents had tried to combat this by insisting that every annual gala include a segment where someone who'd actually known Noel spoke about her. Not about her death, but about her life. About her laugh, her curiosity, her kindness. About the person she'd been when she was just a college student trying to figure out her place in the world. These moments were brief, but powerful. A reminder that all the work the foundation did existed because a real person had been loved and lost. As Noel's parents aged and eventually would pass away, the question of who would maintain this personal connection became pressing. Her roommate had agreed to continue sharing memories as long as she was able. After that, the foundation would need to decide whether to maintain this tradition with someone who'd never known Noel personally, or whether to let that element of the gala evolve into something else. There was no perfect answer. Miles's legacy lived most fully in his music, which was fitting. Musicians still played his songs, still cited him as an influence. A biography had been published a few years ago, thoroughly researched, respectful of his artistry and his family's pain. It introduced Miles to new audiences, contextualized his work within the broader musical landscape of his time, and treated his death as a tragedy rather than a mystery to be solved. His friends had cooperated with the biographer, providing interviews, access to materials, their own memories and insights. The process had been difficult, forcing them to revisit painful history, but the result felt worth it. The book portrayed Miles as they'd known him, as a talented musician and a good person whose life had been stolen. It didn't sensationalize his death or speculate endlessly about unsolved aspects of the case. It honored him. The biographer had asked each friend the same question at the end of their interviews. What do you want people to remember about Miles? Their answers varied but shared common themes. His passion for music, his kindness, his authenticity, his potential, the person he was rather than just how he died. The biographer had woven these perspectives throughout the book, ensuring Miles's humanity remained central. Elise's memory was maintained most privately of all. Her siblings rarely spoke about her publicly, but they thought about her constantly. They visited her memorial stone on her birthday. They included her in family trees and genealogies, making sure future generations would know she'd existed. They told their children about her, carefully, age-appropriately, honestly. One sibling had written down everything she remembered about Elise, every story, every detail, everything their parents had said about her before they died. She'd created a document that could be passed down, ensuring that even as living memory faded, some record of who Elise had been would remain. It wasn't comprehensive. Memory is selective and fallible. But it was something, a testament that Elise had lived, had mattered, had been loved. The document included mundane details that might seem unimportant, but that captured Elise's personhood. Her favorite foods, the way she laughed, how she liked her coffee, the books she'd loved, the career ambitions she'd held, the dreams she'd had for her child. These small facts felt sacred because they were true, because they brought Elise into focus as a complete person rather than just a victim. The broader cultural memory of these cases had calcified into simplified narratives. Each case had been reduced to a few key facts, a brief summary, a lesson or warning. The complexity, the full humanity of everyone involved, the nuanced reality of what had happened and why, these things were lost in the reduction. The cases became examples, teaching tools, content for consumption. This bothered the families, but they also understood its inevitability. Cultural memory requires simplification. Details get lost. Context fades. What remains is the essence, the core story, which serves its purpose even if it doesn't capture everything. They couldn't control this process, couldn't prevent their loved ones from becoming symbols. They could only try to maintain fuller, richer memories among those who cared enough to look deeper. Educational materials about these cases varied in quality. Some were thoughtful, well-researched, respectful of victims and families. Others were exploitative, sensationalistic, more interested in shock value than truth. Law enforcement training materials tended toward the former. Popular media tended toward the latter. The families had no control over which was which, no way to prevent their loved ones' stories from being used in ways they wouldn't have chosen. A criminology textbook had used Noelle's case as an example of online predation. The section was factual and educational, focusing on patterns and prevention rather than gratuitous details. Noelle's parents had been informed and had approved the inclusion. They felt it served a purpose, helped educate future law enforcement officers and researchers. It was a good use of their daughter's story. Conversely, a true crime television show had done a sensationalistic episode about Ria's case years ago, against her family's wishes. They'd focused on dramatic recreations of her murder, speculated about her final moments, interviewed people who'd barely known her. The family had been devastated. They'd complained to the network, but the episode remained available on streaming platforms, continuing to cause harm long after its initial broadcast. Noelle's roommate had gone back and forth over the years. Sometimes she believed the Foundation's work gave Noelle's death meaning. Other times she thought that was a comforting lie, that nothing could justify or redeem the loss of her friend. She'd learned to hold both truths simultaneously. The work mattered and helped people. Noelle's death was still a senseless tragedy. Both could be true. Miles's friends found meaning in continuing to play his music, in keeping his artistic legacy alive. They believed Miles would have wanted that, would have been honored by it. But they also knew that Miles would have preferred to be alive, creating his own music, building his own legacy. The meaning they'd found didn't erase the fundamental wrongness of his death. Elise's siblings mostly avoided the question of meaning. They'd lost their sister and then their parents. They'd lived through years of investigation and trial and aftermath. They were tired of analyzing it, of trying to extract lessons or purpose from it. Sometimes, they'd concluded, terrible things just happen. Not everything has to mean something. Some losses are just losses. The technology that had both helped solve these cases and complicated them continued to evolve at a pace that left everyone struggling to keep up. Privacy concerns battled against security needs. Civil liberties advocates warned against surveillance overreach. Law enforcement argued for tools to solve crimes. Tech companies tried to balance profit, privacy, and public safety. There were no easy answers, only competing interests and imperfect compromises. Cell phone tracking had been crucial in several of these cases, helping establish timelines and movements. But it also raised questions about constant surveillance, about who had access to location data and under what circumstances. The families of the victims generally supported law enforcement having these tools. Others worried about the broader implications for everyone's privacy. Both concerns were legitimate. The tension between them remained unresolved. Social media platforms had been both helpful and harmful throughout these cases. They'd helped spread awareness, mobilize searches, share information. They'd also spread misinformation, enabled harassment of families, and given platforms to conspiracy theorists. The companies running these platforms made incremental changes to policies and features, always reactive rather than proactive, always trying to avoid liability while claiming to care about users. Dating apps had implemented more verification features, but determined predators found ways around them. Some apps required photo verification. Others checked government IDs. But fake IDs existed. Photos could be stolen or manipulated. No system was perfect. Women continued to meet people online, and mostly those meetings were fine, but sometimes they weren't. The risk remained, and so did the difficult question of how to manage it. Young people navigating these platforms had different relationships with risk than earlier generations. They'd grown up with stranger danger warnings, but also with the normalization of meeting people online. They knew to be careful, but also didn't want to live in constant fear. They shared locations with friends, told people where they were going, did the things they'd been taught would keep them safe. And mostly it worked, but not always, and the not always was devastating. Lena's granddaughter thought about this often. She was raising daughters in a world that was both more connected and more dangerous than the one her mother had navigated. She taught them to be cautious without being paralyzed by fear. She shared her mother's story with them, age-appropriately, as a reminder that bad things could happen, but also that their mother had just been living her life, doing normal things. She didn't want them to learn the wrong lesson, to become so afraid that they couldn't function. One of his friends struggled with this the most. They couldn't point to a moment where different choices might have changed the outcome. Miles had just been living his life, going to a show, existing in the world. If there was a lesson, It was the uncomfortable truth that safety was partly illusion, that random violence could strike anyone. This wasn't a comforting message, so it wasn't one that got shared much in prevention education. But it was true. Elise's case had become central to discussions about intimate partner violence and pregnancy. Statistics showed that pregnant women were at increased risk of homicide, that pregnancy could be a trigger for escalating violence in abusive relationships. Elise's story illustrated this with devastating clarity. She'd been planning to leave. She'd been gathering resources. She'd been doing what advocates told women to do. And she'd run out of time. Her case was used in medical training to teach healthcare providers to screen for domestic violence, especially during pregnancy, to recognize the signs, to ask the right questions, to provide resources, to understand that someone could appear fine on the surface while being in terrible danger at home. Some doctors took this training seriously. Others went through the motions. But awareness had increased, and that mattered. Domestic violence organizations used Elise's internet searches as examples in presentations about safety planning. They taught people to use private browsing, to clear search histories, to recognize that the act of looking for help could itself be dangerous if discovered. They emphasized the importance of specialized services that understood the complexity and danger of leaving abusive situations. The searches Elise had made, the evidence of her fear and her planning, had been crucial to prosecuting her killer. But they'd also been heartbreaking for everyone who reviewed them. They showed a woman who knew she was in danger, who was trying to protect herself and her unborn child, who was doing everything she could with the time she had. Reading those searches, knowing how her story ended, was devastating for everyone involved in the case. All 5 cases, taken together, painted a picture of violence that was both predictable and impossible to fully prevent. Patterns existed. Warning signs existed. Risk factors could be identified. But translating that knowledge into effective intervention was complicated by resource constraints, system failures, and the fundamental difficulty of predicting which situations would escalate to homicide. Researchers had studied these cases extensively, adding them to databases, analyzing them for patterns, using them to refine risk assessment tools. This work was valuable and had probably saved lives. But it was also clinical, reducing real people to data points, real tragedies to variables and equations. The families understood the necessity of this work, but sometimes resented the way it abstracted their loved ones into statistics. Lena became a data point in studies of missing persons cases in small towns. Rhea became a data point in research on intimate partner homicide. Noelle became a data point in analyses of online predation. Miles became a data point in studies of unsolved cases that were eventually solved. Elise became a data point in research on pregnancy-related homicide. Each reduced to a number, a case study, an example. This reduction was necessary for research, for learning, for prevention. But it also felt like another kind of violence, another way their humanity was stripped away. The families wanted their loved ones studied if it would help others. They just wished there was a way to do it that preserved their personhood, that kept them from becoming just abstractions. The legacy of these 5 cases was complex and contradictory. They'd led to improvements in how missing persons cases were handled. They'd increased awareness of various threats. They'd inspired advocacy and education. They'd contributed to policy changes and institutional reforms. These were real accomplishments, real good that came from terrible tragedy. But they'd also become content, entertainment for some, obsessions for others. They'd been sensationalized and distorted. They'd caused ongoing pain for families who couldn't escape the public nature of their grief. They'd been used in ways the victims would never have chosen, their stories told by people who'd never known them, their deaths analyzed by strangers who felt entitled to their opinions. And through it all, 5 people remained dead. That was the inescapable fact beneath everything else. All the advocacy, all the education, all the changes, none of it brought them back. None of it gave them the futures they deserved. None of it repaired what had been broken when they died. Their families lived with that reality every day. The world had moved on, as worlds do. New cases captured attention. New victims needed advocacy. New families began their own terrible journeys through grief and justice. The cycle continued, relentless and exhausting. But for those who'd loved Lena, Rhea, Noelle, Miles, and Elise, time hadn't moved on. It had just accumulated, years piling up without the people who should have been there to experience them. Birthdays uncelebrated, weddings unattended, grandchildren unknown, futures unrealized. The absence was permanent and specific and devastating in its particularity. The uncomfortable truth that connected all 5 cases, the truth that no one wanted to acknowledge directly, but that hung over everything, was this: normalcy was the weapon. Not stranger danger, not obvious threats, but the everyday mechanisms of trust, of routine, of familiar faces and comfortable circumstances. That was what had been exploited, and there was no defense against that that didn't require living in a state of constant suspicion, which was itself a kind of death. Lena had trusted someone she knew. Rhea had loved someone who'd seemed safe until he wasn't. Noelle had done her due diligence before meeting someone who'd constructed an elaborate lie. Miles had existed in the world and encountered violence anyway. Elise had built a life with someone who'd ultimately taken that life from her. In each case, danger had worn the mask of normalcy so effectively that by the time anyone recognized it, it was too late. This pattern repeated across thousands of cases, not just these 5. The majority of violence against women came from people they knew: intimate partners, ex-partners, family members, acquaintances. Strangers were statistically less dangerous than familiar faces. But this knowledge didn't make anyone safer, because trust was necessary for human connection. You couldn't function in society without some baseline assumption that most people meant you no harm. And predators understood this, exploited it, weaponized it. The families had wrestled with this reality for decades. How do you warn people to be careful without teaching them to trust no one? How do you promote awareness without promoting paranoia? How do you honor your loved one's memory without making their death a cautionary tale that implied they'd done something wrong? These questions had no good answers, only uncomfortable compromises. Lena's granddaughter told her daughters to be careful, but also to live fully. To trust their instincts, but also to trust people. To protect themselves, but also to take risks. She knew these instructions were contradictory, impossible to follow perfectly. But what else could she say? Don't accept rides from anyone ever? Don't trust anyone? Live in fear always? That wasn't living. That was just a different kind of death. Rhea's friends struggled with similar contradictions when they spoke to young women about domestic violence. They wanted to convey urgency, to make people understand how serious the threat was. But they also didn't want to frighten women away from relationships entirely or make victims feel blamed for not recognizing danger. The balance was impossible to strike perfectly. They did their best, shared Rhea's story, and hoped it helped more than it harmed. Noelle's foundation taught online safety without demonizing online connection. They acknowledged that most people met online were genuine, that most interactions were harmless, that technology enabled wonderful connections as well as dangerous ones. But they also taught verification methods, safety protocols, warning signs to watch for. They tried to make people savvy without making them cynical, careful without being paralyzed. Miles's friends had the hardest time with this because his case didn't fit neat patterns. There was no lesson to extract beyond the fundamental randomness of violence, beyond the reality that you could do everything right and still become a victim. They shared his story as a reminder to cherish the people you love while you have them, to not take safety for granted, to understand that nothing was guaranteed. It wasn't a satisfying message, but it was honest. Elise's siblings, when they did speak publicly, emphasized the importance of listening to women who said they were afraid. They talked about how Elise had been searching for help, how she'd been trying to leave, how she'd known she was in danger. They said the lesson wasn't that Elise should have done something different. The lesson was that the people around her, the systems meant to protect her, should have done more. That when someone says they're afraid, that fear should be taken seriously. The broader conversation around these cases often missed this nuance. It focused on what victims could have done differently, on personal responsibility and individual choices. This was easier than confronting systemic failures, than acknowledging that sometimes doing everything right still wasn't enough, than accepting the uncomfortable reality that safety was partly privilege and partly luck. The families pushed back against this narrative when they had the energy. They insisted their loved ones hadn't failed. They insisted the system had failed. They insisted that responsibility for violence lay with those who committed it, not with those who fell victim to it. But this message fought against powerful cultural currents, against victim-blaming instincts, against the human need to believe that following rules guaranteed safety. People wanted to believe that these tragedies could have been prevented if only the victims had been more careful, more suspicious, more aware. Because if it was the victim's fault, then the rest of us were safe as long as we didn't make the same mistakes. But if it wasn't their fault, if they'd done everything reasonably possible and still died, then the rest of us weren't safe either. And that was too frightening to accept. So the victim blaming persisted, subtle and insidious, even among people who claimed to support victims. She shouldn't have trusted him. She should have seen the signs. She shouldn't have been there. She should have left sooner. These statements, phrased as concern or education, were really about maintaining the illusion of control, the belief that violence was preventable through right choices. The families heard these statements constantly and had learned to recognize them in all their forms. The seemingly innocent questions that implied negligence. The helpful advice that came too late to help and served only to blame. The speculation about what the victim could have done differently. They developed thick skins out of necessity, but it still hurt every time. Lena's mother, before she died, had said something in an interview that her granddaughter still thought about often. She'd said that people needed to understand that her daughter had been a complete person, not a collection of choices to be judged. That Lena had been living her life the best way she knew how, making decisions that seemed reasonable with the information she had. That reducing her to the single choice that ended her life was a way of making her less human, less real, less worthy of grief. The interviewer had pushed back, asked if there were lessons to be learned from Lena's case. Lena's mother had gotten angry then, her voice sharp in a way it rarely was. Yes, she'd said, the lesson is that people kill people. That's the lesson. Not that women need to be more careful. Not that accepting help is dangerous. But that some people choose violence. And until we address that, until we focus on perpetrators instead of victims, nothing will change. The interview had gone viral, shared widely, praised by advocates and activists. But it had also generated backlash from people who felt she was being unreasonable, who insisted that teaching women to be careful was important, who missed the point entirely. Lena's mother had stopped doing interviews after that. She was tired of defending her daughter, tired of explaining basic concepts of accountability, tired of the emotional labor of educating strangers who often didn't want to learn. Ria's father had had similar experiences. He'd been vocal in his advocacy, and people often praised him for it, told him he was strong, told him Ria would be proud. But they also questioned his anger, told him he needed to forgive, suggested that his ongoing pain was somehow unhealthy or excessive. As if there was a proper timeline for grief, an appropriate emotional response to your daughter being murdered. He'd learned to ignore these people, to surround himself with others who understood. Other parents who'd lost children. Other advocates who did the work. His wife. His therapist. People who let him be angry without trying to fix it. Who understood that some things couldn't and shouldn't be gotten over. Who accepted that he would carry this pain until he died, and that was okay. Noelle's parents had aged dramatically in the years since her death. The grief had taken a physical toll. They'd both developed health problems that their doctors attributed partly to stress. They'd both aged faster than their peers, their faces etched with pain that wouldn't fade. They didn't talk about this much, but people who'd known them before could see the difference. Grief had marked them permanently. They attended the Foundation's annual gala, but it exhausted them more each year. The crowds, the questions, the well-meaning people who didn't understand that their sympathy, however genuine, sometimes felt like an intrusion. They loved what the Foundation had become. They just wished they could enjoy its success without having to be constantly reminded of why it existed. Their relationship with each other had been tested by Noelle's death in ways they couldn't have anticipated. They grieved differently, needed different things, sometimes hurt each other inadvertently with their different approaches to loss. They'd gone to counseling, worked hard to understand each other, stayed together through periods when staying together felt impossible. Many couples didn't survive the loss of a child. They had, barely, and the survival felt both like an accomplishment and like a sentence. Miles's parents hadn't survived it, not as a couple. They divorced a few years after his death, both of them too broken to help each other heal. His mother had said once that she couldn't look at his father without seeing Miles, couldn't exist in that marriage without being constantly reminded of what they'd lost. His father had understood. They'd separated kindly, stayed in touch, supported each other from a distance. But they couldn't be together anymore. Both had remarried, found partners who hadn't known Miles, who could love them without that particular shadow. Miles's friends had mixed feelings about this. They were glad his parents had found happiness again, but they also felt strange seeing them with new partners, new lives, moving forward in ways that necessarily meant leaving Miles further behind. It was a normal part of life, people moving on, rebuilding. It just felt wrong somehow. Elise's siblings hadn't experienced the same relationship strains, perhaps because they'd been adults when she died, perhaps because sibling grief operated differently than parental grief. They'd supported each other through the worst of it, leaned on each other, understood each other's pain. They were closer now than they'd been before Elise died, bound together by shared loss and shared memory. But they'd also grown apart from some extended family who hadn't known how to handle the situation, who'd said the wrong things or nothing at all, who'd disappeared during the hardest times. Grief revealed people's limitations, showed who could handle darkness and who couldn't. Elise's siblings had learned who their real family was, and the configuration looked different than it had before. 30 years after the disappearances, most of the primary actors in these dramas were gone or aging out of active involvement. The cases belonged to history now, to the next generation, to people who studied them academically or discussed them as distant events rather than lived experiences. The emotional immediacy had faded for everyone except those most directly affected, and even for them, the grief had changed shape. This was natural, inevitable. Time moved forward. People died. Memories faded. The world changed. But for Lena's granddaughter, for Ria's friends, for Noelle's roommate, for Miles's fellow musicians, for Elise's siblings, these cases would never be historical. They would always be personal. They would always be about people they'd loved who'd been stolen from them by violence that should have been prevented. And they would carry that knowledge, that grief, that anger for the rest of their lives. It wouldn't define them entirely. They were more than their losses. But it would always be part of who they were, part of how they understood the world, part of what shaped their choices and their relationships and their understanding of safety and danger and trust. The most dangerous moment, they'd all learned, wasn't when someone disappeared. It was every moment before that, every instance of trust extended, every normal day that could become someone's last without warning. It was the gap between what seemed fine and what was actually happening. It was the space where danger disguised itself as safety, where violence wore the mask of normalcy, where ordinary choices led to extraordinary harm. This was the uncomfortable truth at the heart of all 5 cases. The truth that the families lived with. The truth that advocates tried to address. The truth that society struggled to accept. That safety was fragile. That trust could be weaponized. That the most dangerous threats often came from the least suspicious sources. That doing everything right guaranteed nothing. That some losses couldn't be prevented, only grieved. And in that grief, in that ongoing acknowledgement of what had been lost and what it meant, these 5 people, Lena, Ria, Noelle, Miles, and Elise, continued to exist. Not as they would have chosen, not as they deserved, but as memories held by people who loved them, as names that meant something, as lives that mattered, as reminders that behind every case, every statistic, every true crime story, there was a person, someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone's love, someone whose absence left a hole that would never be filled, whose life had mattered more than their death ever would, whose memory deserved to be honored not as a lesson, but as a loss. As the final thought settles in, it's important to recognize that these stories, these 5 lives, represent countless others. The victims who never make headlines. The families who grieve without public acknowledgement. The cases that go unsolved forever. The disappeared who remain missing. The truth is uncomfortable and necessary. Violence like this continues, patterns repeat, and the most we can do is remember, advocate, and refuse to let the dead become invisible. If you found this story compelling, if it made you think, if it moved you in any way, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling us where you're from and what time you're watching. These stories matter. These people mattered. And sometimes, the act of remembering is the most important thing we can do.